Chapter 12 of Charles Sumner, The Scholar in Politics by Archibald Grimke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Red Spirits and Grey. A truly momentous year was 1856 in the political annals of the Union. The strife between freedom and slavery was raging the while in Kansas and at the seat of the federal government at Washington, where it culminated in the assault on Sumner. It is memorable also as marking the last triumph at the polls of the slave power in America and the first appearance of the new Northern Party in national politics. This year, the Republican Party made its debut on the national stage and swept the free states with the magnificent courtesy of more than 1 1/3 million of votes. If the new party of freedom failed to elect its candidates, Fremont and Dayton, neither did the old party of slavery succeed in securing for its candidates, Buchanan and Breckinridge, a majority of the polls by something like nearly 400,000 votes. The long primacy of the South and the overlordship of the slave power in the Union drew almost visibly after this Pyrrhic victory to their violent and tremendous downfall. Seeing how matters must conclude for it and its ill-gotten gains, should the excitement growing out of the repeal of the Missouri Compromise continue in the North with no abatement of its energy, the slave power hit upon a bold, bad, and desperate device to compose it. This was no other than the famous or infamous judgment of the Supreme Court in the case of Dred Scott, which declared the unconstitutionality of the Missouri Compromise. If that act was ab initio null and void, it followed plainly enough that its repeal could not have worked any legal detriment to the interest of the free states in the upper division of the Louisiana Territory. If they had nothing under the arrangement of 1820, and the Act of 1854 took that nothing away from them, what great consequence had they suffered because of this sort of congressional addition and subtraction? But the North was not deceived by the solemn and partisan jugglery of the majority of the judges on the Supreme Bench upon the subject. Its moral sense was besides shocked by the bold inhumanities of the decision directed against the Negro race. For deep within the Northern heart, buried to be sure within labyrinthine selfishness and pride, there was an idea, a feeling that the black man did have rights which white men were bound to respect, the obiter dicta of the Supreme Court to the contrary notwithstanding. The suspicion, too, that the highest judicature of the land, one of the coordinate branches of the national government, had only acted a part assigned it by the slave power, served to add fuel to the flames of agitation which the authoritative voice of that tribunal was evoked to allay. And so, after all this shrewd calculation, the anti-Nebraska excitement was not composed, and it went rapidly, in fact, from bad to worse. The prohibitory legislation of 1820, torn from the statute book by the slave power, was not blotted at the same time from the breasts of Northern freemen. Congress and the Supreme Court had not power to erase the great fiat of liberty written there. The unconquerable temper with which free Kansas rose with the emergency with which it encountered the aggressions and outrages of the army of slavery, backed as that army was by the whole authority of the national executive, proved the folly and futility of the repeal, proved also the folly and futility of the squatter sovereignty dogma as an instrument for introducing slavery into the territories. When the slave leaders perceived that this much vaunted dogma was unequal to the introduction of slavery into the territories, it was promptly discarded by them, and another better adapted to the accomplishment of their purpose selected in its stead. The other was Calhoun's supreme dogma of the self-extension of slavery under the Constitution, as Benton phrased it, together with its corollary, the obligation of Congress to protect by law the slaveholder in the enjoyment of his constitutional right to slave labor against a hostile territorial majority. Theretofore the Southern shibboleth had been Congress has no power to legislate on the subject of slavery in the territories. Now it became the duty of Congress to safeguard the institution within the territories. Not until a territory had attained to statehood, according to this latest position of the South, could the principle of popular sovereignty operate to exclude a master and his slaves. Stephen A. Douglas was altogether too great and selfish a politician to enact the role of a mere tool. If he consented to serve the slave power, it was doubtless because he calculated that he could serve self at the same time, could advance designs of his upon the presidency. He knew that his popular sovereignty doctrine measured the full length of his political tether. Not an inch beyond the principles set up by him in 1854 in solution of the territorial problem did he dare to venture. To shift his position, taken then to this last and desperate pretension of the South, would be passing politically upon himself a death sentence. And Douglas was not of the self-renouncing kind. He loved power too greedily to imperil his leadership at the North, even to please the slave power. The little giant drew defiantly and proudly off from his Southern allies on the Lecompton issue. On that issue, the erstwhile united and invincible Democratic party ran sharply upon a question which was to shake it to its center and eventually split it in two. In this posture of affairs between Douglas and fellow Democrats at the South, an old prophecy of Calhoun found fulfillment. For Northern representatives, even so audacious and powerful a public man as was Douglas, were, when they came to act, looking not to the South but to the North for their political cue. Douglas, puissant as he undoubtedly was in Illinois, dared not to bow before the imperious will of the slave power at this juncture. Willing or unwilling, he had to move with the currents of public opinion in his own state. Indeed, he owed his re-election to the Senate over Lincoln, a few months later to his courageous and uncompromising tone in the Lecompton debate. The wrath of the South burned hotly against its old Confederates in aggression and wrong. In obedience to its behest, he was deposed from the chairmanship of the Senate Committee on Territories and stood, it was bruited, in some danger of being read out of the Democratic Party. Events were plainly getting beyond the control of the politicians, escaping as from Pandora's box on every hand to the confusion and discomfiture of the compromisers at the North and those at the South. It was an instance of the irrepressible fermentation of contrary ideas working from within outwardly in obedience to rooted social differences and antagonisms between the sections. The South was the victim of a system of labor which early withdrew from it the power of choice and then drove it forward blindly by the force of an inexorable necessity upon its fate. The North was likewise the creature of an industrial principle whose resultant interests and institutions slowly took away from it the power of self-determination in its conflicts with slave labor, and impelled it in a line of social expansion as distinct from that of the South as is light from darkness, civilization from barbarism. Never to any wide extent were the free states abolitionists. They opposed slavery so far only as slavery menaced their interests, and no further. They loved the Union. They had no love for the slave. To preserve the one, they were ever disposed to sacrifice the freedom of the other. But happily for the slave, his freedom could not be immolated utterly on the altar of the Union, without entailing upon his immolators, to a certain extent, a loss of political power. And this possible consequence to themselves served to withhold the Northern people from abandoning him entirely to his wretched fate. From the first, therefore, the passion of the free states for sectional ascendancy pushed them gradually away from the South and toward the slave. As the contest for political supremacy waxed between the sections, the line of separation lengthened between the North and the South, and lessened between the North and the slave, until in due time liberty and the Union grew to be one and inseparable. But this converging of the sectional interests of the free states and of freedom to the slave upon a single point was a long and tumultuous process, as the reader well knows. The thing which the South demanded the North could not yield, and that which the North asked for the South could not grant. The South demanded more slave territory, more slave states, while the North was compelled in self-defense to resist all further extension of slavery to the soil of the Republic and to oppose the admission of more slave states into the Union. Certainly the two sections were not fed with the same food, for what might be meat to the one was apt to prove poison to the other. A startling episode like John Brown and Harper's Ferry was the flashlight by which destiny revealed to themselves and to each other the hearts of those natural and irrepressible enemies. In these circumstances it did not take that wise man Abraham Lincoln long to discover for the Northern people that their Union could not endure permanently half slave and half free. The discovery of that momentous fact had been made by 70 years of experiment and conflict. This truth during that long period had deepened and spread at the South. It had deepened and spread at the North, more slowly to be sure, but with not less certainty or constancy than in the other half of the country. The logic of Southern aggression tended to make the Union all slave, that of Northern resistance to make it all free. The sectionalism of the Douglas wing of the Democratic Party differed in degree only from the sectionalism of the Republican Party. Neither would go the whole length of Southern demand. Both went part way, the latter stopping in this respect considerably short of the former, but the same force which arrested the one halted the other also. That force was the growing consciousness of the people of the free states of deep and abiding differences and antagonisms between the interests and institutions of their section and those of the slave states. But to fail the South at this juncture in one particular was to fail it altogether. So at least reasoned her leaders. To throw her back with her inferior colonizing resources upon the dogma of popular sovereignty as an instrument for opening new regions for the extension of slavery was not the deed of a friend but of a foe. Douglas, therefore, and his faction, the South, grew to hate with a bitterness hardly less than that with which it hated Lincoln and his party. Both were denounced as enemies which no Southern man true to his section could support. In the Charleston Convention, the two wings of the Democratic Party collided in a contest of unbridled passion. The South demanded as a sine qua non to any further union between the party North and the party South the incorporation into the party platform of the dogma that slavery extends itself under the Constitution to the national territories, together with its corollary that Congress is bound to safeguard by law the human property of slaveholders within the territories, popular sovereignty to the contrary notwithstanding. But an act of such stultification of madness the Douglas men dared not commit. Their refusal to place the party upon this Southern plank was the signal for the disruption of the Democratic organization, which was speedily followed by the dissolution of the Union. But it is time to return to the story of Sumner's life. He had not resumed his seat in the Senate many months before his collisions with its slave masters began anew. One of the earliest of these skirmishes he had with Mason of Virginia over a memorial from Mr. Frank B. Sanborn of Concord, Massachusetts, representing to the Senate how he had been treated by certain persons acting under orders from one of its special committees. Mr. Sanborn's case grew out of John Brown's raid into Virginia and an attempt on the part of the Senate committee appointed to investigate the matter to compel him to testify touching his knowledge of the expedition. As Mr. Sanborn was not disposed to go willingly to Washington, the sergeant-at-arms of the Senate deputed certain persons to take him into custody and convey him to the Capitol. This the deputies on the evening of April 3, 1860, proceeded to do. They succeeded partially in the accomplishment of their purpose, viz., in getting Mr. Sanborn into their possession and slipping handcuffs upon him, and were about to slip him into a carriage when, owing to the presence of mind and courage of a sister, the friendly succor of neighbors, and the efficacy of the habeas corpus, they were finally foiled and forced to release their prisoner. These circumstances were recited to the Senate by Mr. Sumner, who presented the memorial, whereupon Mason, who was the chairman of the Harper's Ferry Committee, moved that the memorial be rejected. This brought Mr. Sumner to his feet with the remark, "The senator moves that the memorial be rejected," and he makes this unaccustomed motion with a view to establish a precedent in such a case. I feel it my duty to establish a precedent also in this case by entering an open, unequivocal protest against such an attempt. Sir, an ancient poet said of a judge in hell that he punished first and heard afterwards. Casti Godque auditque, and permit me to say, the senator from Virginia on this occasion takes a precedent from that court. Of course, Mr. Mason, who professed not to be used to such language within or without the Senate, was terribly shocked by this sulphurous and burning allusion to his motion to reject the memorial of Mr. Sanborn. Sumner was not content with striking when struck, as in the instance just given, but he would take the initiative as well. And when this he did, the slave power had occasion to think of him with emotion for many a day afterward. His long disability and absence from his post had not abated a tittle of his hatred of slavery, or of its domination in the Union. That hatred and the puritanical sternness and aggressiveness which characterized his opposition to the slave power had, if anything, increased during those years of illness. In public life there was no man who so hated slavery as did Sumner. Certainly not Seward, nor Chase, nor Hale, nor Wilson, nor even Giddings. Sumner's hatred of it as a political evil surpassed theirs, while to this unequaled hostility was added an intolerance and abhorrence of it as a moral wrong, felt only by such men as Garrison, Phillips, Theodore D. Weld, James G. Birney, Eliezer Wright, Frederick Douglass, Parker Pillsbury, and Stephen S. Foster. He was in truth in 1860 the incarnation of iron will and iron convictions on the subject of slavery, political and moral. All this appears in that grand and terrible philippic entitled The Barbarism of Slavery, delivered by him in the Senate June 4, 1860. In this speech, which was made on the bill for the admission of Kansas as a free state, Sumner condensed the whole horror and curse of slavery, reflected its image with a fierce realism and scorn which was worthy of Garrison himself. In the early years of the Republic, it was general, almost universal, in the slave states to look upon slavery as a political evil and a moral wrong. Slave masters were among the loudest and sincerest in denunciation of it as such, among the most earnest of the early abolitionists who hoped for its ultimate extinction, but owing to several causes of a political economic nature discussed by the writer in his Life of William Lloyd Garrison under the caption The Hour and the Men, Chapter 4, page 92, and to which he begs to refer the interested reader. This early expectation in regard to slavery failed to be realized. The evil, on the contrary, entered upon a period of extraordinary social and political expansion and power. And with this change there was inaugurated another. The early toleration of the South gave place in time to passionate attachment to the monster. It became no longer an evil, a wrong to be extirpated, but a positive good to be cherished, as Calhoun proclaimed it on the floor of the Senate in 1837. Presently, devotion to slavery grew to be general through the South. In 1860, when Sumner made his speech on the barbarism of slavery, it was practically universal. The slave states no more blushed for their social system, but by the mouths of their leaders vaunted it rather as the most solid and durable foundation on which to rear free and stable political institutions, and as the cornerstone of our republican edifice, as a great moral, social, and political blessing, as the normal condition of human society, as ennobling to both races, the white and the black, etc., etc., etc. Sumner's speech was in part an elaborate and merciless exposure of the groundlessness of these assumptions. He exposed the barbarism of slavery under the two heads of the character of slavery and of the character of slave masters. In the preparation of his argument, Sumner had evidently acquainted himself with the entire body of the laws and the literature bearing on the subject. He came with chapter, section, and page of the Black Book of Slavery at his finger's end. The whole awful record he unrolled during the 4 hours that he held the attention of the Senate. The enormities of the slave code and the enormities of the slave character filed in a long and terrific procession before the Senate and the country. Slave masters were made to see themselves in the dehumanizing monster which they were hugging as they appeared to the moral sense of the age. His exhibition of the character of slave masters in congressional history was as pungent, effective, and thorough as truth and the arts of the orator could make it. With the Congressional Globe in one hand, he drew aside with the other the curtain of years, a curtain which concealed a series of shameful and turbulent scenes, such as have rarely disgraced the annals of parliamentary proceedings. Just as the records had caught the lords of the lash, pictures of vulgarity and violence, they were reproduced with their swagger, their insolence and oaths, with their bowie knives, their bludgeons and firearms, defiant of the laws of debate, of decency, and of the deity alike. And this stern exposure he fitly closed with a view of the melancholy unconsciousness which constitutes one of the distinctive features of this barbarism. Next to the unconsciousness of childhood, observed the orator, is the unconsciousness of barbarism. The real barbarian is unconscious as an infant, and the slave master shows much of the same character. No New Zealander exults in his tattoo, no savage of the northwest coast exults in his flathead more than the slave master of these latter days. Always, of course, with honorable exceptions, exults in his unfortunate condition. The slave master hugs his disgusting practice as the Carib of the Gulf hugged cannibalism, and Brigham Young now hugs polygamy. The delusion of the goiter is repeated. This prodigious swelling of the neck, nothing less than a loathsome wallet of flesh, pendulous upon the breast, and sometimes so enormous that the victim is unable to support the burden, crawls along the ground, is common to the population on the slopes of the Alps, but accustomed to this deformity, the sufferer comes to regard it with pride, as the slave masters with us unable to support their burden, and crawling along the ground regard slavery, and it is said that those who have no swelling are laughed at and called goose-necked. If the speech 4 years before roused all the dark and malignant passions of the South against him, this one could do no less, for while it did not single out by name particular representatives of slavery for punishment as did the former, its general scope and overwhelming effect carried its argument and charge of colossal guilt and iniquity home to the individual consciousness of each as well as all. He had attacked the whole. He had attacked every mother's son of the slave oligarchy. The slave masters of the Senate and House were metaphorically and literally ready, during the progression of the terrible philippic and at its conclusion, to tear the defender of humanity to pieces. A newspaper writer sketched at the time the scenes in the chamber during the delivery of the speech. Mr. Breckinridge remained all the time, wrote an occasional correspondent of the Chautauqua Democrat, and sat with an open book in his hands, pretending to read, but his eyes wandered from the page, and with a frown upon his brow he finally gazed at the speaker till he closed. Jefferson Davis pretended to be reading the Globe, but it was plain to be seen by the heading of the paper that it was upside down. Wigfall seemed in torment. He listened respectfully a while, and then glided silently around from one senator to another, and conferred in whisper. He seemed to be hatching mischief, but the grave shake of the head of the older senators doubtless kept this uneasy, restless desperado quiet. Hunter sat like a rock immovable, and listened respectfully to the whole. Not a muscle moved upon his placid face to denote what was going on in his mind. Toombs heard the most of it quietly, and with as much of a don't-care look as his evil passions would permit. Near the close, Cheap's gray Mason came in and took his seat and commenced writing a letter. He evidently intended to show the galleries that Sumner was too small for him to notice, but he soon found a seat in a distant part of the hall, and an easy position where he sat gloomily scowling upon the orator till he sat down. When the speech was about half through, Keitt, the accomplice of Brooks in his attempted assassination of Mr. Sumner, came in and took a seat near Senator Hammond. For a while he sat gazing about the galleries, evidently to notice the dramatic effect of his presence upon the audience there, but few seemed to notice him. By degrees he began to pay attention to the speech. Curry of Alabama and Lamar, Mississippi, members of the other house, though Southerners of the straightest sect, could not conceal their delight in the oratory and classic and scholarly feast before them. They were scholars and orators themselves, and could appreciate an intellectual treat, though the sentiments were so obnoxious. On the Republican side, breathless attention prevailed. Those who immediately surrounded the senator were Mr. Wilson, Senator Bingham, John Hickman, Preston King, and Solomon Foote. Mr. Seward sat in his usual seat, and scarcely moved during the delivery of the great speech. By the time Sumner had finished speaking, the slave masters of the Senate had hit upon an answer, and this Mr. Chestnut of South Carolina was selected to make, and this was the answer. Mr. President, after the extraordinary, though characteristic speech just uttered in the Senate, it is proper that I assign the reason for the position we are now inclined to assume. After ranging over Europe, crawling through the back door to whine at the feet of British aristocracy, craving pity, and reaping a rich harvest of contempt, the slanderer of states and men reappears in the Senate. We had hoped to be relieved from the outpouring of such vulgar malice. We had hoped that one who had felt, though ignominiously he failed to meet the consequences of a former insolence, would have become wiser, if not better, by experience. In this I am disappointed and I regret it. Mr. President, in the heroic ages of the world, men were deified for the possession and the exercise of some virtues: wisdom, truth, justice, magnanimity, courage. In Egypt also we know they deified beasts and reptiles, but even that bestial people worshipped their idols on account of some supposed virtue. It has been left for this day, for this country, for the abolitionists of Massachusetts to deify the incarnation of malice, mendacity, and cowardice. Sir, we do not intend to be guilty of aiding in the apotheosis of pusillanimity and meanness. We do not intend to contribute by any conduct on our part to increase the devotees at the shrine of this new idol. We know what is expected and what is desired. We are not inclined again to send forth the recipient of punishment, howling through the world, yelping fresh cries of slander and malice. These are the reasons which I feel it due to myself and others to give to the Senate and the country why we have quietly listened to what has been said and why we can take no other notice of the matter. To this characteristic Southern answer, Mr. Sumner, gaining the floor with difficulty, replied briefly thus, addressing the President: only one word. I expose today the barbarism of slavery. What the Senator has said in reply I may well print as an additional illustration. That is all. Mr. Chestnut's wrathful little performance was charged to the muzzle with explosives, with savage and intolerable hate. It was the typical Southern answer to anti-slavery arguments, with the bludgeon and the bowie knife left out. But if they were left out, it was for the occasion only, as an incident which occurred on the fourth day after the speech evinced. About 6 o'clock in the afternoon of that day, Mr. Sumner was called on by a stranger who introduced himself as a Southerner and slaveholder, and demanded of the slanderer of states and men an explanation of his speech, and avowed his intention to hold him responsible therefor. But the defender of humanity, though an ardent peace man, who eschewed war and the duel and all appeals to force for the settlement of differences between nation and man, as unworthy of a Christian age, nevertheless believed with no less ardor in the right and the duty of self-defense when put to it by bullies and assassins. He therefore ordered the ruffian to leave the room, which he did, but not before breathing out vengeance against the author of the barbarism of slavery, and threatening to return with 3 others who had come with him from Virginia expressly to hold the orator responsible. After having this notice of intended violence served upon him, Mr. Sumner sent for his colleague Henry Wilson, who promptly repaired to the lodgings of his friend, and while there a second unknown man called to see Sumner, but when he was apprised that the object of his call was not alone, he suspiciously declined to enter. A few hours later 3 strange men called, but when they were informed that they could not see the Massachusetts senator alone, they too turned away with the sanguinary message that they would call again in the morning for a private interview, and if they did not get it, they would cut his blank throat before the next night. Such a murderous message was not ignored by the friends of Mr. Sumner. On the contrary, Anson, Burlingame, and John Sherman slept that night in a room opening into the bedroom of their friend, prepared to teach Southern fire-eaters that if blood was to be spilt, Northern men proposed to be on hand at the next spilling appointment and join in the operation. Nothing, however, came of the matter. The bloody-minded visitors failed to repeat their call either that night or the next morning. The noise of the incident reaching the ears of the mayor of Washington, that official requested Mr. Sumner to make an affidavit of the facts, but this, owing to a want of faith in the magistrates of that city, he declined to do. The original offender, a well-known officeholder of Virginia, was at length discovered and brought to Mr. Sumner's room by the mayor. The fellow apologized for the part he had taken in the affair, but denied all knowledge of the others who had left the sanguinary message. Without Sumner's being aware of it at the time, faithful friends stood watch over him at night and attended him as a bodyguard between his lodgings and the Senate. This latter service was performed by Kansas citizens under the command of Augustus Wattles, from the door of the House to the door of the Senate, and vice versa. All unknown to the object of their solicitude, these determined men followed him day after day with revolvers in hand. The speech had other results. Coming as it did about the beginning of the presidential campaign, it produced a sensation among the army of politicians and editors who attach higher value to party success than to everlasting principles. Many there were among this always too numerous class, and who perhaps have never been more so than during the period of the national canvass of 1860, regretted the delivery of the speech and bewailed the fancied harm it would inflict upon the Republican party in the contest. But as time passed and the contest waxed, the squad of croakers and compromisers who were troubled and anxious about everything under the sun in the world of politics except freedom and for the slave, learned that the speech had not injured the chances of their party's success, but had instead really improved them. With the common people began to sing another tune in regard to it and its brave and eloquent author. The speech was printed as a campaign document in several large editions and sent broadcast over the free states while the author was in urgent demand as a speaker throughout the North. In Massachusetts he spoke many times during the canvass, and in New York once when he made a powerful speech on the origin, necessity, and permanence of the Republican Party, in which he restated the argument against slavery, but with this single exception, possibly from fear of a relapse, he did not speak out of his own state, though again and again importuned to do so by Republican committees from Maine to Illinois. The alarmist and loudmouthed friends of the Union converted the barbarism of slavery to their own mischievous purposes. In it they professed to descry the real but concealed character and aims of the Republican Party, the Black Republican Party, as it was called, to make it odious with the people of the free states. The dissolution of the dear Union, in the event of the triumph of that party at the then approaching elections, was held up to frighten the North into a refusal to support the Republican candidates. A vote for Lincoln was in sooth a vote for disunion, and to Sumner's speech the alarmists pointed for confirmation of that gloomy vaticination. Here is one way in which the New York Herald, taking the speech for a text, artfully held up the terrible consequences to the country of Republican success. But there is one characteristic of this speech which is in perfect accordance with the policy of the Black Republican Party in the present campaign. The bloody and terrible results which must ensue if that party succeeds in getting possession of the federal government are kept carefully out of view. John Brown's practice is taught, but there is no word of John Brown. The social condition of 15 populous, rich, and powerful states is to be revolutionized, but not a hint of possibility of resistance on their part, or of the reactive effect of such resistance upon the aggressive North, is dropped. Whoever else trimmed and tacked his principles and convictions to weather the gusty currents of the times, Sumner did not. No stress or fury of the political elements, no impending peril and disaster could make him turn from his course and fly before the storm. Throughout the campaign, which terminated in the election of Lincoln, he held his undeviating way toward the restoration of the Republic to its original anti-slavery character, when freedom was national and slavery sectional, to the emancipation of the government from the domination of the slave power, to the total annihilation of the idea wherever the jurisdiction of the Constitution extended, whether in the territories of the District of Columbia or on the high seas under the national flag, that man can hold property in man. The uncompromising spirit which characterized his course before the elections characterized it not less afterwards, when the anti-election alarmists doubled their activity and the apprehensions of the friends of the Union at the same time. In that period of dreadful suspense which intervened between Lincoln's election and the beginning of secession, it seemed almost as if the whole North was in a panic of fright and ready to suggest or support any concession to the South in order to save the Union. Give, give, give was in the mouths of the most powerful politicians and leaders of the victorious party of freedom. Lincoln, Seward, Thurlow, Weed, and company were in the mood for making extraordinary concessions to the South and sacrifices of the anti-slavery principles of their party to induce Jefferson Davis, Howell Cobb, William L. Yancey, and company to refrain from breaking up the precious Union and brotherhood of right and wrong, for which the government, as organized and administered, had stood for 70 years. At every door and on every brow sat gloom and apprehension. An appalling uncertainty was indeed scaring statesmen and people. But the thoughts and words of Sumner were not those of the terrified people and leaders. There was light on but one difficult and perilous path, the path of duty, of national righteousness. In this one true way he confidently planted his feet. Thick fogs were around him. A wild, chaotic sea of doubt and danger encircled him and the country, but he hesitated not, nor swerved to the right hand or to the left, to find an easier and safer way of escape. Straight on up he climbed, calling through the rising darkness and tumult to his groping countrymen to follow. Nothing is settled which is not right. Peace, ever-enduring peace, comes only to that people who dare to put down sin and lift up righteousness, rang firm and clear from him in this tremendous crisis in the life of the nation. He was in very truth then the faithful one. He saw the supreme peril which impended over the Republic and felt assured that it was not in secession and civil war, but in the timidity and selfishness which, in order to avert these, were disposing the Northern people and their leaders to compromise the principles of liberty, inclining then to make fresh and disastrous concessions to slavery. If his anxiety was great, his vigilance, earnestness, and activity rose to the high level demanded of him in the emergency. No uncertainty vexed his conscience or disturbed his courage. Whatever questions admitted of conciliatory treatment, the slavery question admitted of no back-down on the part of the free states. Not another inch of concession should be made by them to the evil power which had devoured their peace and trodden down their best interests, and which no surrender, short of absolute and unconditional, could permanently pacify. If disunion and civil war were crouching in the rough way of the nation's duty, the nation must not turn aside to avoid them. It ought, on the contrary, resolutely, regardless of consequences, to seek first to establish itself in justice and liberty. This bravely and finally done, he did not doubt that then every other good thing would be added to it. Seeing how matters were with people and politicians and the temptations which were assailing them through their fears to betray liberty to her ancient foe, Sumner seized every opportunity which came to him to fix their wavering faith, to steady their faltering purpose, to bring the government back to its earlier and better policy, when freedom and not slavery was national. His timely lecture on Lafayette, the Faithful One, was among the potent instrumentalities employed by him in achieving this result. In exalting Lafayette and unrolling the splendid record of his glorious life, where fidelity to liberty shone conspicuous and supreme, Sumner held up to the living this lofty historic personage for guidance and inspiration, and with the flame of the illustrious Frenchman's sacred and unconquerable animosity to slavery, the lecturer sought to kindle to a consuming blaze the flickering opposition of the North to the American barbarism and the long-enduring tyranny of the slave power. As the term of Buchanan drew to its close and that of Lincoln to its commencement, the apprehensions of the North increased apace, and the operations of the alarmists increased apace also. The pressure put upon Congress to induce the adoption of conciliatory measures was redoubled. A Boston delegation of white-livered friends of the Union, with Edward Everett at its head, went to Washington to urge upon Northern representatives the necessity for mutual concessions in the interest of harmony and the preservation of the dear Union. Mr. Sumner has recorded how the timid old orator went to him at his lodgings, and with much emotion besought him to bring forward some conciliatory proposition, saying, "You are the only person who can introduce such a proposition with a chance of success." And Sumner has recorded his reply also. "You are mistaken in supposing that I have success with compromise," said he to the venerable time-server and trimmer. "If I could bring it forward, if I am strong with the North, it is because of the conviction that I cannot compromise. But the moment I compromised, I, too, should be lost." Thrice happy it was that at this juncture Massachusetts had not an Edward Everett in the Senate, or seated in her gubernatorial chair. In her new governor the Commonwealth found a tower of strength, while in him Sumner found a man after his own heart. Firm, indeed, was John A. Andrew against the clamor for compromise. In January 1861 he wrote Sumner in Washington, "From war, pestilence, and famine, from all assaults of the world, the flesh, and the devil, good Lord, deliver us, but most especially from any compromise with traitors or any bargain with slavery." With another time-server and trimmer, Sumner had a characteristic interview about this time. This one was James Buchanan. He had sought an audience with the President in relation to a subject touching the state of the country. When the conversation was concluded on this head, Sumner said, "Mr. President, what else can we do in Massachusetts for the good of the country?" "Much," was the reply. "What?" queried Sumner. "Adopt the Crittenden propositions," responded the Chief Magistrate. "Is that necessary?" asked the senator with a backbone. "Yes," answered the President, who belonged unmistakably to the breed of political invertebrates. Massachusetts has not yet spoken directly, was Sumner's answer, but I feel authorized to say that such are the unalterable convictions of her people. They would see their state sunk below the sea and turned into a sandbank before they would adopt propositions acknowledging property in men and disfranchising a portion of her population. Northern compromisers, among other reactionary measures, urged the repeal or modification of the personal liberty laws in conciliation of the South. There were attempts in Massachusetts to obtain the abrogation of the laws for the protection of fugitive slaves. To William Claflin, then chairman of the Republican State Committee and president of the Senate, Sumner wrote touching this subject, "In the name of liberty, I supplicate you not to let Massachusetts take any backward step, not an inch, not a hair's breadth." And to Governor Andrew he closed one of his letters with words which betray an agony of anxiety lest Massachusetts should retreat from the high ground occupied by her before the elections. "In God's name, stand firm. Don't cave, Andrew," he wrote. "Save Massachusetts from any surrender, the least." Sumner's solicitude and activity at this crisis was a potent influence in strengthening many a weak back in the legislature and making the adoption of any material concession to slavery impossible. Governor Andrews' unflinching and uncompromising front stood watch over the personal liberty laws and warded off the evil machinations of the compromisers. In February 1861, he wrote Sumner how he had made known to some persons that they could not get anything through this room, the council chamber, not conformable to certain principles and which did not contain certain details unless they marched it through by dragoons. Sumner's letters to the governor from January 17 to February 20, 1861, are eloquent of the excitement and apprehensions of the times, of the author's firmness, vigilance, and fidelity in the great cause of country and humanity. Their sustaining power was of immense account to John A. Andrew in those early and critical weeks beginning his term in the executive chair of the state. "I do not think we should allow this opportunity to pass," Sumner wrote him, "without trying the question whether a single state can break up the Union. What is it worth if held by any such tenure? And again, the question must be met on the Constitution as it is, and the facts as they are, or shall we hereafter hold our government subject to this asserted right of secession? Should we yield now, and any offer is concession, every presidential election will be conducted with menace of secession by the defeated party. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, and Alabama had already seceded and raised the standard of rebellion. Before the end of the month of January, Georgia and Louisiana were to do likewise. On the 21st, the senators of the seceding states made their dramatic exit from the Senate. Treason and the plottings of traitors filled the air of the national capital with rumors of impending violence. The panic of the compromisers in consequence grew every 24 hours in magnitude and threatened to precipitate the free states into a dishonorable retreat. On the very day that Jefferson Davis and company withdrew from the Senate, Sumner wrote Governor Andrew, "Pray keep our beloved Commonwealth firm yet a little longer, and the crisis will be past. Save her from surrender. Nothing she can do will stay secession. Impossible." And 2 days later, "Nothing that Massachusetts can do now can arrest one single state. There can be no other result except our own humiliation and a bad example which will be felt by all other states. If Massachusetts yields one hair's breadth, other states may yield an inch or a foot, a furlong or a mile." Again, a few days later, he wrote the governor, "The mistake of many persons comes from this. They do not see that we are in the midst of a revolution where reason is dethroned and passion rules instead. If this were a mere party contest, then the circulation of speeches and a few resolutions might do good. But what are such things in a revolution? As well attempt to hold a man of war in a tempest by a little anchor borrowed from Jamaica Pond. And that is what I told the Boston Committee with regard to their petition. I have but one prayer: stand firm, keep every safeguard of human rights on our statute book, and save Massachusetts glorious and true." Rumors were now flying thick of plots to seize Washington by the rebels, to convert the departments into rebel forts, etc. More than the loss of forts, Sumner's correspondence with the governor continues: "Arsenals or the national capital, I fear the loss of our principles." These are now in greatest danger. Our northern fort, Sumter, will be surrendered if you are not aroused. In my view, the vacillation of the Republicans is more fatal than that of Buchanan. And again, thus, every word of concession thus far has done infinite mischief, first by encouraging the slave masters, and secondly by demoralizing our friends and filling them with doubt and distrust. And finally, when the pressure of apprehensions began to lift from his mind and light to break through the gloom, the heart burnings and divisions showing themselves in our party a few weeks ago are none the less active. Those fatal overtures will fall to the ground. Oh, that they never had been made. Certain conciliatory propositions contained in a speech by Seward in the Senate, and made to placate the South and save the Union, were undoubtedly the fatal overtures alluded to. 4 days before Lincoln's future Secretary of State delivered the objectionable speech, he read it to Sumner, who pleaded in vain with him to omit the foolish and futile offers to the South which it contained. This period of appalling crisis and suspense, so crowded with miserable scenes of weak and vacillating leaders, so full of wretched and bootless efforts and overtures to satisfy the slave power, was abruptly terminated by the roar of cannon in Charleston harbor. It was the Southern answer to the fatal overtures of the friends of the Union. The sort of response which the North would make to the challenge was at once apparent in the tremendous popular uprising which followed the bombardment of Sumter. The Union must and shall be preserved was the mighty purpose which swept the free states together and launched them as one man against the rebellion. Sumner, as was his wont, had lingered in Washington after the close of Congress. He was in Washington when President Lincoln issued his first call for troops. There he remained, busying himself attending to public duties appertaining to him as a senator and patriot until the afternoon of April 18th, when he left for the North. At Baltimore, he got off the train and went to Barnum's Hotel, where he meant to put up for the night. That the city was in a state of unusual excitement he soon perceived. On his way from the hotel to the home of an old family friend, where he took tea and spent the evening, he found that the excitement had increased. He himself was addressed in a manner not to be mistaken. Returning that evening to the hotel, he was met by an acquaintance who enlightened him as to the object of the excitement, which had risen during the evening to the dimensions of a great mob. He was informed that it was after him, that it had already been to the hotel in quest of him. Having learned so much, he pushed on to Barnum's and called for the key of his room, when he was taken into a retired spot by the proprietor and an attaché of the hotel, and put in possession of the facts of the case and of the danger he was in personally, and in which the house was also from the mob, should they return again during the night. But in all that city there was no place in which Sumner could take refuge other than the hotel, and as a traveler he insisted upon his rights under the circumstances, much as he regretted the peril which his presence in the house might involve the property of the proprietor. He was then given a room in a wing of the hotel, less accessible to the mob should they attack the house during the night. The greatest secrecy was observed as to the number and location of the room occupied by Mr. Sumner, as an additional safeguard against the spirit of mischief which was abroad in the city that night, and which was to enact next day those scenes of riot, bloodshed, and treason which can never be forgotten. In the gray of the next morning, Mr. Sumner left the hotel for the Philadelphia depot, where he boarded the northward bound train. Between the two cities his train passed that which was transporting the 6th Massachusetts Regiment to the national capital. Before Sumner reached Philadelphia, the tragedy of the 19th of April, 1861, had been begun and finished in the streets of Baltimore, and the first bloodshed of the war had passed into history. On his arrival in New York, he called on Major Charles Devens and his battalion, hurrying like the then glorious 6th to the defense of the national capital. Sumner addressed the men, giving them for a watchword, Massachusetts, the Constitution, and freedom. The time for speech, however, had ended, and the time for doing and dying had come, and this no one recognized more quickly and heartily, peace advocate though he was, than Sumner. Blood and iron was the stern but simple formula for saving the Union. Blood and iron, as a recipe for destroying slavery, he believed could prove no less potent. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Charles Sumner, the Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimke, This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Carthago est delenda. The two antagonistic ideas of the Union, after 70 years of expansion and conflict, had crashed together in the storm of civil war. Northern interests were not separable from the Union. To it, undoubtedly, the free states owed their unprecedented increase in population, their surprising development of material resources, and their rapid augmentation of wealth. Naturally enough, therefore, they held in abhorrence a Southern Confederacy, for destruction of the Union carried, as a consequence, ruin to all this growth and prosperity. The war on the part of the free states was for the maintenance of the Union, and for no other purpose. Lincoln's indifference as to the fate of slavery in this emergency of the Republic was hardly less complete or shocking than was that of Douglas, who cared not whether slavery was voted up or voted down in the national territories, since popular sovereignty was vindicated. Lincoln, as president, was not concerned as to whether slavery survived or perished, if only the Union survived. As a man, he was probably not indifferent on this point, but as president he avowedly meant slavery within the states and entrenched within the Constitution and the laws of the land, no harm from the war power of the government over which he presided. He was openly, notoriously, for maintaining the Constitution as it was, the Union as it was, even to the execution of its infamous fugitive slave laws. It took 2 years to reveal to the President and the Republican party the folly of such a purpose, the madness of a statesmanship which was pouring out blood and treasure to preserve the federation of two contrary social systems under a single general government, when the opportunity offered of putting an end to one and of establishing forever the other. At length it was perceived beyond a peradventure that the institution which the administration was preserving was the pith, the marrow, and backbone of the rebellion. It too was seen that the fortunes of the slave and the fortunes of the Union were not detachable and distinct the one from the other, but identical and indissoluble. Then it was that the slave was emancipated and made a soldier to save a Union essential to the supremacy of Northern ideas and to the security of Northern interests and institutions in America. Sumner, during the antebellum period of crisis and suspense, recognized with all his old-time clarity of vision the constitutional limitations of the political movement against slavery. He did not propose to touch the evil within the states because he had not the power. To the utmost verge of the Constitution he pushed his opposition. Here he drew up ready to cross this Rubicon of the slave power should justificatory cause arise. Such he considered was the uprising of the South in rebellion. Treason canceled the covenants of the Constitution and discharged the North from their further observance. He was at last, untrammeled by political conditions, free to carry the war into Africa. Carthago est delenda was thenceforth constantly on his lips. It is the vogue now to extol the marvelous sagacity of Abraham Lincoln, and the writer, too, will join in the panegyric of his great qualities. But in the matter of emancipation, that wise man was not infallible, the opinion of his latest biographers to the contrary notwithstanding. He waited for the people, but the people were really ready for the act as a war measure before he was. When he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, the South but a little later began to weigh the military necessity of a similar movement. Sagacious, undoubtedly, the President was, wonderfully so, but slow at times also to a surprising degree, and this was true with regard to his conduct in relation to the liberation of the slaves. To have saved the Union with slavery was surely not such a preservation of his as mere worldly prudence ought to have dictated. All that it could possibly have accomplished was a short postponement of the final struggle for mastery between what was morally and industrially wrong and what was morally and industrially right in the Republic. A day of wrath this struggle would have been in 1900 as it was in 1861. To put off this day then would have consummated the most stupendous crime of fathers against children of modern times. Yet such was distinctly Mr. Lincoln's purpose as president. It certainly was not Mr. Sumner's as senator. Justice was his solitary expedient, right his unfailing sagacity. Of no other American statesman can this be so unqualifiedly asserted. Here he is, the transcendent figure in our political history, and yet he was no fanatical visionary, utopian dreamer, but a practical moralist in the domain of politics. When President and party refused to heed him, and turned from his simple and straightforward remedy to try others, he did not break with them, nor sulk at his post. On the contrary, foot to foot and shoulder to shoulder, he pulled with both as far as they would go. Where they halted he could not. Stuck as the wheels of state and of the war were in those dreadful years in the mire of political expediency and pro-slavery hunkerism, he appealed confidently to that large unknown quantity of courage and righteousness latent in the North to set the balked wheels again moving. The policy of forbearance towards slavery, which characterized to so remarkable an extent the early part of Mr. Lincoln's administration, was at first interpreted liberally by Mr. Sumner. The President seemed to be making haste slowly to attack the enemy at a vital point, which course during the first months of the war Sumner cordially approved. And this approval he communicated to Mr. Lincoln in the month of May preceding the Battle of Bull Run, adding, however, that the President must be ready to strike when the moment came. Upon the happening of that event, Sumner felt that the time had arrived for the adoption of a presidential policy of active hostility toward the peculiar institution, and this conviction he imparted to the President 2 days after the Bull Run disaster. But Mr. Lincoln received the suggestion with undisguised impatience. No, the moment had not come to strike slavery. Instead of striking slavery, the administration struck several thumping blows upon the backs of the slaves in its jealous regard for the rights of masters. Fugitive slaves, so ran a general order from Washington July 17th. Fugitive slaves will, under no pretext whatever, be permitted to reside or in any way be harbored in the quarters and camps of the troops serving in this department. Neither will such slaves be allowed to accompany troops on the march. Commanders of troops will be held responsible for a strict observance of this order. 6 days afterward, the administration, through Attorney General Bates, reminded the United States Marshals of Missouri that the Fugitive Slave Act must be executed, and to General Butler's famous suggestion that the able-bodied Negroes liable to be used in aid of rebellion were contraband of war, the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, replied in August that it is the desire of the President that all existing rights in all the states be fully respected and maintained. August 30th, General Fremont, commanding the Western Department, had made proclamation that the property, real and personal, of all persons in the state of Missouri who shall take up arms against the United States or who shall be directly proven to have taken an active part with their enemies in the field is declared to be confiscated to the public use, and their slaves, if any they have, are hereby declared free men. Notwithstanding the outburst of popular satisfaction with which this last clause of the order was received, President Lincoln promptly countermanded it. He was plainly bent on saving the Union, if he could, without in any manner disturbing the status quo of invested interest in the slave states. This amazing conservatism was unspeakably painful to Sumner and excited his keenest apprehensions in respect of its demoralizing consequences in the conduct of the war. It was injurious to the cause of the Union at home and abroad. It operated in the South to strengthen, not weaken, the spirit of rebellion. Sumner, unable to influence the President, turned to the people. Perhaps they could show the administration the error of its way, induce it to change its policy of forbearance to bold and active anti-slavery measures. As early as July, he endeavored to get Congress to inaugurate a new and militant policy in the treatment of rebels. 2 bills introduced by him into the Senate prior to the Battle of Bull Run provided for the confiscation of the property of traitors. This was one way, certainly, of starting off on a new departure in the conduct of the war. At the Republican State Convention of Massachusetts, which met at Worcester, October 1, 1861, he demonstrated in an electric speech that emancipation was the best weapon for putting down the rebellion and saving the Union. It is not necessary, even borrowing a familiar phrase, he declared with singular sagacity, to carry the war into Africa. It will be enough if we carry Africa into the war in any form, any quantity, any way. The moment this is done, rebellion will begin its bad luck, and the Union becomes secure forever. Facts, a year later, completely verified this bold prediction. On the evening of November 27th, before the Young Men's Republican Union of New York at Cooper Institute, he pointed out in an argument of masterly force that slavery was the origin and mainspring of the rebellion. Wherever this rebellion shows itself, whatever form it takes, whatever thing it does, whatever it meditates, exclaimed the orator, it is moved by slavery. Nay, the rebellion is slavery itself incarnate, living, acting, raging, robbing, murdering, according to the essential law of its being. And again the slaves toil at home, while the masters work at rebellion, and thus by singular fatality is this doomed race, without taking up arms, actually engaged in feeding, supporting, succoring, invigorating those battling for their enslavement. Full well I know that this is an element of strength only through the forbearance of our own government. And coming to the point of the argument, he finds that something more is needed to encounter successfully the rebellion than men and money. That decisive something which the war for the Union wanted was ideas. Our battalions must be reinforced by ideas, he sums up, and we must strike directly at the origin and mainspring. I do not say now in what way or to what extent, but only that we must strike. In no way can we do so much at so little cost. To the enemy, such a blow will be a terror. To good men, it will be an encouragement, and to foreign nations watching this contest, it will be an earnest of something beyond a mere carnival of battle. There has been the cry, "On to Richmond," and still another worse cry, "On to England." Better than either is the cry, "On to freedom." Let this be heard in the voices of our soldiers. Aye, let it resound in the purposes of the government, and victory must be near. No opportunity did Sumner now miss to press upon President, Congress, and the country the duty and necessity of emancipation. From this time forward he never saw Mr. Lincoln without urging him to strike the great criminal, without warning him that then was the accepted time for dispatching the monster. But Mr. Lincoln did not so apprehend the situation, nor the urgency of immediate action. He would wait yet a while longer. He was, according to his own calculation, but 6 weeks behind Sumner. The weeks, however, stretched into months, and still the presidential arm was stayed. In the meantime, Congress was not inactive. It took the initiative in the military movement against slavery as the origin and mainspring of the rebellion. In the measure to confiscate property used for insurrectionary purposes, slaves so employed were declared free by the act, which, on its approval by the President August 6, 1861, was the beginning of emancipation. This act was followed in March 1862 by another, which prohibited the employment of the national forces and the return of fugitive slaves. It was thus largely through the earnestness and determination of Sumner that a path was hewed for the feet of Mr. Lincoln to emancipation as a measure of military necessity. When the slave masters retired from the Senate and the Republican party obtained control of that body, Mr. Sumner was placed at the head of the Committee on Foreign Relations. In this position, he was enabled to render inestimable services to the country and to the cause of freedom as well. His extensive acquaintance in Europe and his immense acquisitions as a student of history and of international law made him a power at home and abroad during the progress of the war as chairman of that committee. His speech on the Trent episode was one of the greatest services rendered by him to the administration and the country in that capacity. Two of Sumner's old enemies, James M. Mason, the former chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations, and John Slidell of Louisiana, were appointed to represent the rebel states, the former at the court of St. James and the latter at the court of Napoleon III. In October 1861, with their two secretaries, they eluded the blockade at Charleston and were landed at Havana. From this place they took passage in the British mail packet Trent for St. Thomas, where a line of steamers connecting with the Trent ran to England. When near St. Thomas, the Trent was stopped by the United States steamer San Jacinto, commanded by Captain Wilkes, and the rebel commissioners and their two secretaries were taken into custody and removed to the national steamer. This proceeding of Captain Wilkes, though in strict accord with British precedent, was in violation of the principle in that regard uniformly contended for by America. But this latter fact was at first quite lost sight of by the statesmen and diplomatic scholars and lawyers of the land. The capture gave general satisfaction in the United States, made Captain Wilkes the hero of the hour. In England, however, the act excited very different emotions. It brought the hostility of that country toward the United States to a head. The English government demanded the surrender of the traitors, and in case of the refusal of the American government to comply therewith, instructed its minister at Washington, Lord Lyons, to return to London with the entire legation. Pending the consideration of this demand by the administration, Great Britain, like the wild boar in the fable, began industriously to whet its tusks for a war which in its consequences must have proven disastrous to the cause of the Union and of freedom alike. Plainly, under the circumstances, there was but one course for the American government to pursue, and that was to throw itself back upon American practice rather than upon British precedent, and surrender the prisoners. And this it did, though not without embarrassment, in view of the popularity of the capture of those men and of the deep resentment felt by all classes against the demand for their release. If the popular feeling was warlike in England, it was equally so in America. The government, in getting rid of a war with England, could ill afford to do so by forfeiting the respect and confidence of its own citizens, whose love of country was without doubt sorely wounded by what to the public eye seemed like an ignominious back-down before British insolence and menace. It fell to the lot of Sumner to rescue the administration from this predicament by appeasing the irritated national amour propre, which he achieved in a masterly speech before the Senate, January 9, 1862, entitled "The Trent Case and Maritime Rights." He demonstrated to the almost universal satisfaction of the country, if not of the world, that the surrender of the rebel commissioners was not a back-down, but that, on the contrary, it was in strict accord with American principle and practice touching the right of search of neutral vessels at sea by belligerent powers. It was the American contention that these powers could not, in the exercise of the right of search, board neutral vessels at sea and take out of them persons on whom such nations might otherwise have perfectly valid claims. This grand principle was now established by the demand of England and the act of America. America, therefore, had no cause for feeling humiliated by the surrender of the prisoners, but rather the strongest reason for experiencing a sense of accomplishment and triumph. To her other glories she had added the glory of leading the way to the reformation of long existing abuses and wrongs in the law of nations. If America had surrendered the rebels to England, England had surely surrendered a bad principle and the support of many bad precedents to America. The speech produced a profound impression at home and abroad. The London Times was greatly chagrined at the skillful manner in which the orator had turned the surrender to the advantage of the American government and of the American people. "The great object of this remarkable oration," growled a famous correspondent of the Thunderer, "is to prove that the surrender of Messrs. Slidell and Mason is a great triumph for the American government. There is proverbially no accounting for taste, and if the American people are of Mr. Sumner's opinion, I do not see why we should complain of their contentment." But neither the Times nor its famous correspondent was able to laugh down, or sneer down, or argue down the force of the speech. Sumner, with his customary thoroughness, had done what he set out to do, vindicated the government, established for it in the popular regard a fresh claim to the confidence and support of the loyal North. And this was in effect dealing another blow upon the head of slavery, the supreme traitor, the origin and mainspring of the rebellion. Sumner's labors for the recognition of the independence of the black republics, Haiti and Liberia, by the United States had similar results. He found the spirit of slavery entrenched in public opinion and the laws of the land, and it was his purpose to strike it there as well as at the South in its chattel form. If dislodged from those coigns of vantage in the Republic, if disowned by public opinion and expelled from the national statutes, he believed that it could be the more readily and effectively dealt with in the rebellious states. A move for the recognition of the black republics was a move against the many-headed wrong of slavery. Before the war, the slave power refused all recognition of Haiti and Liberia as members of the family of nations. Nearly a year after the opening of hostilities, President Lincoln, with characteristic caution, suggested the subject to Congress in his annual message, remarking that if any good reason exists why we should persevere longer in withholding our recognition of the independence and sovereignty of Haiti and Liberia, I'm unable to discern it. He goes on to say that he is unwilling to inaugurate a novel policy in regard to them without the approbation of Congress, and thereupon submits to its consideration the expediency of an appropriation for maintaining a charge d'affaires in each of those new states. This was enough for Sumner, who immediately took the matter up and pursued it with such zeal, discretion, and perseverance that in June these states received their long-deferred recognition at the hands of the United States. Governor Andrew felt that the recognition of Haiti and Liberia was in effect the recognition of the colored man of the Union as well, and that the passage of the law placed a fresh jewel in Sumner's crown. The considerable and essential service of Sumner toward the success of the measure found grateful acknowledgment and appreciation from the two countries. The Liberian commissioners Alexander Crummell, Edward W. Blyden, and J.D. Johnson, who were at the time in Washington, promptly expressed the sentiments of Liberia to Mr. Sumner. Had it not been for your masterly policy, they wrote him, and your wise discretion, allied to a most persistent determination, we have reason to doubt whether the bill of recognition would not have met with a miscarriage during the present session of Congress. The objection to the passage of the Bill of Recognition by Mr. Salisbury of Delaware is so absolutely absurd, so incredibly comic and utterly asinine, that the writer begs to reproduce it as a curiosity of the ratiocination of a slave master's mind in a senatorial debate. It is evident, observed the acute Mr. Salisbury, that this bill is going to pass. I want the country, however, to know that according to the rules of the Senate, foreign ministers have a right upon this floor, and we have set apart a portion of the gallery for the ministers and their families. If this bill should pass both houses of Congress and become a law, I predict that in 12 months some Negro will walk upon the floor of the Senate of the United States and carry his family into that gallery which is set apart for foreign ministers. If that is agreeable to the taste and feeling of the people of this country, it is not of mine. To mine, and I only say that I will not be responsible for any such act. With this I will content myself. The final suppression of the slave trade by treaty between Great Britain and the United States was another effective blow dealt the hydra of the land, the ratification of which by the Senate received the powerful aid of the chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations. The ratification of a treaty between the two countries giving to each on the coasts of Africa and America a restricted right of search in suspected vessels flying the national colors of the other was, so long as the slave power dominated the Senate, a thing impossible of accomplishment. The right was yielded for the African coast, but persistently withheld for the American, where it was notorious that slavers prowled with their African victims for the southern market. But as the war waxed, a new spirit arose in the North against this inhuman commerce. A federal law had denounced it as piracy and punishable with death. But while the slave power ruled, the law remained on the statute book a dead letter. The rising hatred of slavery as the origin and mainspring of the rebellion, which was spreading through the North, galvanized on February 21, 1862, into sudden and terrible life the dead letter of that law in the execution under it at New York of Nathaniel Gordon, an African slave trader. The treaty for the final suppression of the atrocious traffic passed the Senate April 24, 1862. 8 days before the ratification of the treaty for the suppression of the African slave trade, slavery was abolished by law in the District of Columbia. Sumner sustained a principal part in the consummation of this great act. He was pained and discouraged by the absence from the annual message of the President of any proposition or discussion touching emancipation. There was nothing in that document to indicate that Mr. Lincoln was considering the subject at all. On the contrary, the President had told him of circumstances which might lead him to infer that Mr. Lincoln was still opposed to the use of this best weapon in the prosecution of the war for the Union. From the report of Simon Cameron, then Secretary of War, the President had struck a strong passage in relation to this very matter. But notwithstanding these unfavorable symptoms, Sumner began to feel assured that the President was seriously grappling with the question. It was not long before Sumner's faith in the President was happily confirmed. Early on the morning of March 6th, he was summoned to meet Mr. Lincoln, who read to him the draft of the special message of that date, proposing compensated emancipation. Sumner, who was never inclined to attach much value to the schemes for compensated emancipation, especially on a large scale, was too thankful for this evidence that the President was ready to move abolitionward, to take a new departure, however slight, from the old policy of forbearance, for other than cordial words of welcome for the message. At his instance, the President struck a doubtful paragraph from the draft. That day, the message was communicated to the Senate that the good work, as far as Mr. Lincoln was concerned, was begun, although no practical results followed this particular act of his. The principle of compensated emancipation on a small scale had been embodied in a bill introduced in the Senate by Henry Wilson, December 16, for the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. Sumner, unwilling to endorse the principle of compensated emancipation because it involved recognition of right of property in persons, treated the measure as a scheme for the ransom of the slaves at the national capital, rejecting with indignation the wild and guilty fantasy that man can hold property in man. He nevertheless was ready to help to build a bridge of gold for the banishment of the barbarism of slavery. Amidst all present solicitudes were the fervid and cheering words with which he closed his able and elaborate argument in support of the bill for emancipation. Amidst all present solicitudes, the future cannot be doubtful. At the national capital, slavery will give way to freedom, but the good work will not stop here. It must proceed. What God and nature decree, rebellion cannot arrest. And as the whole widespread tyranny begins to tumble, then, above the din of battle, sounding from the sea and echoing along the land, above even the exaltations of victory on hard-fought fields, will ascend voices of gladness wherever civilization bears sway, to commemorate a sacred triumph whose trophies, instead of tattered banners, are ransomed slaves. On April 16, 1862, the District Emancipation Act received the approval of the President. It was freedom's first practical victory over slavery in the government. Mr. Lincoln, true to his character for going slow where any disturbance of the status quo of the invested interests of slave masters was involved, withheld his approval from the measure 5 days after it passed the House. This delay of the President gave rise to no little anxiety on the part of the supporters of the bill. Among these anxious friends was Mr. Sumner, who during this painful period called on Mr. Lincoln and expressed the astonishment which he felt that the author of the special message on compensated emancipation could postpone his approval of the District Emancipation Act a single night. Do you know who at this moment is the largest slaveholder in this country? Sumner asked the great man with caustic irony, and without waiting for reply, answered thus: "It is Abraham Lincoln, for he holds all the 3,000 slaves of the district, which is more than any other person in the country holds." But if Mr. Lincoln was loath to meddle with the status quo of slavery in the Union, not so was Mr. Sumner, who was ever in motion and running a tilt, now at one, now at another of the many heads of the colossal evil. Now it was against the incredible meanness of that proscriptive spirit which denied to the colored citizens going abroad the passport of the government, or which refused to issue patents to inventors on account of color. Now it was against those twin abominations which erected a man's color into a legal barrier to his carrying the mails, or made it a ground for excluding his testimony in judicial proceedings held under the Black Code of the District of Columbia and of the slave states, wherein, so runneth the black letter of the black law, any Christian white person is concerned. Sumner began his efforts for the annulment of this infamous law while the District Emancipation Bill was under consideration in the Senate. Aware that its total abolishment would not be immediately effected, he moved to amend the bill by the addition of a provision which prohibited the exclusion of any witness on account of color in proceeding held under the Act. This was the thin edge of the movement for the civil rights of colored persons in the United States, the first step taken by the government toward equality before the law. Having obtained so much for his colored fellow citizens, Sumner, a few months later, made a second attempt in the same direction, and this time it was to extend the immunity to all judicial proceedings in the district. The second attempt proved also successful, and equality began to erect its benign crest over the black code of the national capital. Sumner, ever persistent and indefatigable, made a third attempt still further to broaden the immunity by extending the operation of the principle of non-exclusion to the Southern states in judicial proceedings had under the Confiscation and Liberation Act. But this step was farther than the Senate was ready to go at that time, and so Mr. Sumner's amendment was rejected. Congress, like the President, was singularly timid in inaugurating any novel policy in that regard, surprisingly tender of the rights and prejudices of slave masters at the expense of the slaves. Defeat had no deterrent effect upon a mind like Sumner's. Failing once, he tried again and again until he succeeded. 3 times he attempted to extend the principle of non-exclusion and equality to the proceedings in the courts of the United States before he was enabled to carry his point. In the summer of 1864, he attached his proposition to the Sundry Civil Appropriation Bill as an amendment and thus forced its consideration upon the Senate. John Sherman trusted that after the experiences of last night, when the thermometer here rose to 93 degrees and we were exhausted by debate on an irrelevant matter, the senator from Massachusetts would not introduce upon this appropriation bill a topic of this kind. But Mr. Sherman's protest was in vain, for neither the heat of the evening nor the disapproval of senators could deter Sumner from his purpose to purge the laws of the Union of the stain of slavery and to redress the wrongs of an oppressed race. His vigilance and persistency secured at this time a double triumph for freedom. On the selfsame appropriation bill, he grafted an amendment for the abolition of the coastwise slave trade. In no other way had he been able to force the continued existence of this barbarism upon the attention of the Senate. Mr. Sherman, as chairman of the Finance Committee, deprecated the amendment, not because he was opposed to the proposition, but that he wanted his bill kept free from disputed extraneous political questions. But Sumner was firm, uncompromising, and so in the end the Senate and not he yielded, and the writer passed with the bill. Thomas H. Hendricks of Indiana, in the course of a speech in opposition to Sumner's amendment for the abolition of the coastwise slave trade, uttered the following significant remarks: "I'm surprised that any senator should oppose the proposition of the senator from Massachusetts, for we all know that eventually it will be adopted. The objection as to its materiality or proper connection with the measure is but an objection of time. No gentleman can question that the senator from Massachusetts will eventually carry his proposition. Why then contest the matter longer? It may as well come now as at any time. The fact is, Sumner was the anti-slavery trail finder and path opener for the government. Where he made a way, Congress and President were in time sure to follow. His earnestness and radicalism were not always relished by the administration and his associates in the government. That, however, did not make him less so. It was for him to press forward himself and to urge forward others in this emergency, whether they chose to hear and heed him or not. He had an intolerant and compromising manner toward slavery and toward anyone who sought to buttress its barbarisms with the authority of the nation whose life it was seeking to destroy, which was at times, no doubt, a sore thorn in the sides of the cautious, conciliatory president. Edward Stanley, provisional governor of North Carolina, arouses the hot indignation of this man with his passionate hatred of slavery by an attempt to revive the black code of that state, which made the teaching of Negroes a criminal offense. When Sumner heard of this shameful attempt, he hurried to lay the matter before Mr. Lincoln. Not finding that usually placid and jocose magistrate at the Executive Mansion, Sumner followed him to the War Department. There he laid his case before Mr. Stanley's master, but Mr. Stanley's master, possibly worn out with the abolition badgering with which he was treated by Mr. Sumner whenever they met, either by accident or appointment, and possibly struck also by the apparent triviality of the subject and the inopportunity of the visit, quite lost his patience, exclaiming petulantly, "Do you take me for a school committee man?" "Not at all," Sumner replied. "I take you for President of the United States, and I come with a case of wrong in attending to which your predecessor, George Washington, if alive, might add to his renown." Such earnestness and dignity smoothed the ruffled temper of George Washington's worthy successor, who thereupon, with perfect kindliness, considered the case with his friend. At last, after nearly 2 years of terrible conflict and destruction of life to save the Union with slavery, Mr. Lincoln was ready to try the other horn of the dilemma and test the salvability of the nation without slavery. To this end, on September 22, 1862, he announced his purpose to grasp emancipation as an instrument in the struggle. On that date he issued his preliminary proclamation, which declared that the slaves in all states in rebellion on January 1, 1863, should be thenceforward and forever free. Directly the President had firmly seized emancipation as a weapon for putting down the rebellion, Sumner started the agitation for colored troops. 2 weeks after the preliminary proclamation was issued, he launched from the platform of Faneuil Hall the proposition to turn the slaves into soldiers. He pointed to Crispus Attucks, to Peter Salem, and to heroic instances during the war for the Union as proof positive that the Negroes possessed the stuff out of which good fighters were formed. Strike slavery the origin and mainspring of rebellion with the strong arm of the slave. Destroy the rebellion by destroying slavery and arming the blacks. Emancipation and colored troops are the powder and ball which Providence hath rammed into the cannon of the North. Empty the providential broadside into the flanks of the foe. These and more he thundered in the ears of the government and the country. Other and mightier voices were thundering for colored troops also, passionate voices of lamentation, of frightful reverses, of broken and flying armies, of baffled friends of the Union whose hearts were growing sick at the gloomy, the almost hopeless outlook for a speedy restoration of peace to a bleeding and distracted land. As early as July 1862, the disastrous fortunes of the Union forces were constraining the government in its emergency to make use of all the means which the state of the country had put within its reach for the suppression of the rebellion. Military necessity was plainly demanding that the services of the blacks in some capacity should be enlisted on the side of the nation, and so on the 17th of that month the President affixed his approval to a bill authorizing him to receive into the service of the United States for the purpose of constructing entrenchments or performing camp service or any other labor or any military or naval service for which they may be found competent persons of African descent, and such persons shall be enrolled and organized under such regulations not inconsistent with the Constitution and laws as the President may prescribe. This was the first cautious step taken toward carrying Africa into the war, the beginning, in fact, of colored troops. On February 9, 1863, Mr. Sumner introduced in the Senate a bill for the enlistment of slaves and other persons of African descent, but the measure was allowed to sleep the sleep of death in the military committee to which it was referred. It was not until a year afterward that the subject was revived in the House by Thaddeus Stevens, when the employment of colored troops was expressly authorized. Colored troops were employed, however, many months before the tardy enactment of this law. On January 26, 1863, Secretary Stanton gave permission to Governor Andrew to raise a colored regiment. This regiment, the afterwards famous 54th, was raised, and the following May ordered to the seat of war in South Carolina, where, under its gallant young Colonel Robert G. Shaw, it demonstrated before Fort Wagner that the blacks had the stuff of true soldiers in them. Subsequently, Massachusetts sent 2 other regiments of colored soldiers into the field, one of infantry and the other of cavalry. Their fighting qualities were soon established. If at first the employment of colored troops was a hard riddle to many minds, those 3 black regiments wrote the glorious answer clear and large for the nation to read, and the nation, notwithstanding its pro-slavery goggles, which minimized and distorted everything connected with the humanity and manhood rights of this unfortunate race, was not so blind to its own emergent needs as to miss the point and immense significance of the lesson writ in the blood and valor of its colored contingent. But though the North was not in these circumstances blind to its own dire needs, it proved on almost every occasion calling for justice to its colored allies, blinded enough to their simplest demands for fair and equal treatment. There is something incredibly mean in that pro-slavery spirit which, after calling men to fight and die to preserve the life of the nation, could refuse them equal pay with the other soldiers on account of their color. Nevertheless, of such incredible meanness was the government certainly guilty toward its colored troops. Keenly did Mr. Sumner feel this outrageous discrimination against his wards. Again and again he attacked it, sought repeatedly to place the black soldiers on an equality in respect of pay and bounty with their white brothers in arms. He was not alone in efforts to this end. Wilson and Frisenden in the Senate perceived with him the wrong and endeavored to have it redressed, but not with the moral earnestness and persistency which characterized the endeavors of Sumner in that regard. The 54th and the 55th Massachusetts regiments of colored troops enlisted with the understanding that there was to be no discrimination against them on account of their color. But all the same, the government paid them $10 a month, where it paid $13 to the privates of white regiments. Massachusetts tried to correct this injustice by making up out of her own coffers these $3 to the men, but when this difference was sent to be paid to those 2 regiments, they firmly declined to receive the money, lest by so doing they compromised their demand for equality in the army. In February and June of 1864, Mr. Sumner pressed this subject upon the attention of the Senate, arguing that the wrong done had no warrant in law, since those regiments did not enlist under the Act of 1862, which contained a special provision with reference to African troops, but under that of 1861, which contained no such provision and authorized enlistments for 3 years. The question was finally settled not by legislation, but through the interpretation of the statutes by the law department of the government. The Attorney General, Mr. Bates, in affirming the equal rights of colored soldiers, put an end to this odious cast distinction in the national service and constrained the government to a step of tardy justice. The government in both its legislative and executive branches manifested from first to last an extraordinary timidity or indisposition to advance the interest of the colored race. Fear of the border states was probably responsible for much of this singular conduct, but color phobia in the government itself played, without doubt, an important part in its production. The records of those years are full of examples of this character. Here is an instance in point. Henry Wilson, as early as January 1864, embodied in a bill to promote enlistments a clause declaring that when any man or boy of African descent, or in service or labor in any state under its laws, should be mustered into the military or naval service of the United States, he and his mother, wife, and children shall be forever free. This perfectly just and very moderate measure required a year and a month before its friends could secure its enactment into law. Future generations, exclaimed Sumner in his closing remarks upon the bill, future generations will read with amazement that a great people, when national life was assailed, hesitated to exercise a power so simple and beneficent, and this amazement will know no bounds as they learned that Congress higgled for months on a question whether the wives and children of our colored soldiers should be admitted to freedom. Slavery died hard. Fugitive slaves were hunted in the District of Columbia, even after the passage of the District Emancipation Bill. The poor fleeing creatures were returned again and again to their owners by the Union armies. These acts became so frequent and general that Congress in the summer of 1862 prohibited military and naval officers from erecting themselves into commissioners for the return of fugitive slaves on pain of being dismissed from the service. In February 1864, Mr. Sumner reported from the Committee on Slavery and Freedmen a bill for the repeal of all acts for the rendition of fugitive slaves. The bill he accompanied with a comprehensive report reviewing the history and influence of slavery in the government in its relation to these acts, and closing with a demand for their entire and instant repeal. But notwithstanding that the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued more than 13 months before, and that the Secretary of War had more than a year previously given Governor Andrew official permission to raise a regiment of colored troops, and that at the time of its introduction in the Senate several colored regiments were in the field fighting the battles of the country, yet the history of its passage through Congress was another repetition of the old shameful story. That the repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act should be bitterly opposed by the Democrats was not at all surprising, but we confess to no little astonishment in noticing that Senator Sherman obstructed its passage through the Senate, that he actually sought to emasculate the bill by an amendment which saved the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793 in full force on the statute book, and that this proposition was adopted and grafted on the bill by the Senate. Mr. Foster of Connecticut on April 20, 1864, made an elaborate argument in vindication of the Act of 1793. With Mr. Sherman's pro-slavery amendment grafted upon his bill, Mr. Sumner wisely refrained from pressing it to a vote, but determined, as he not infrequently did in similar circumstances, to await the action of the House, which on June 13th passed a bill repealing all the Fugitive Slave Acts. This measure Mr. Sumner reported in the Senate and pressed to a vote. It was not until the 28th of June that this bill became a law, that is, more than 5 months after the date on which Mr. Sumner introduced the proposition in the Senate. However, thanks to his persistency, Congress had at last made an end to those wicked laws and dealt another blow to the expiring slave hydra. The main proposition ever is to strike slavery whenever you can hit it, retorted Sumner to John Sherman during the consideration of the bill to liberate the wives and children of colored soldiers. Mr. Sherman had moved to postpone consideration of the measure with a view that we may act upon the main proposition, to wit, the constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. Sumner was certainly not less earnest and persistent for the adoption of the constitutional amendment than was Mr. Sherman, but he did not feel that because the joint resolution was on its passage through Congress that all anti-slavery efforts were to be pretermitted in the meantime, and without doubt it behooved him, who was bent on the death of slavery as no other member of the government was, to continue without cessation the struggle for its destruction, for the joint resolution was more than a year on its way through both branches of Congress, and it was 2 years in all from its introduction to the final ratification of the amendment by the requisite number of states and proclamation of that fact by Mr. Seward, the Secretary of State. Sumner was right to take nothing for granted where slavery was concerned, to regard the enactment of no measure, however just and expedient, which involved the abolishment of the curse as a foregone conclusion. He was strongly and sternly unwilling to commit the fate of the slaves in any degree to the chapter of accidents and chances. He was for striking the fell destroyer of the freedom of the colored race and of the peace of the Union whenever and wherever Congress could do so, and this was at all times and under all circumstances his main proposition. The final breaking down of caste distinction on the street cars of the District of Columbia was achieved largely through his active and persistent hostility to it. In hitting it, he knew well that he was hitting one of the many heads of the monster wrong of the land, and it was characteristic of him that when he began to operate with his club upon one of those baleful heads, he desisted not until that particular foe of freedom was subdued and beaten to the earth. One after another of the street car lines of the Capitol he attacked as they entered the Senate to obtain renewals of their franchises, with his invariable amendment to their respective bills for incorporations, provided that there shall be no regulation excluding any person from any car on account of color. The last of these street railway companies to succumb was the Washington and Georgetown Company, which in February 1865 surrendered to the genius of equality before the law. After this time, it was illegal for any street railway company in the District of Columbia to exclude from its cars any person on account of color. But even then, Mr. Sumner did not put aside his club, and well that he did not, for the fight for equality on the cars was not yet finished. The Washington and Georgetown Company neglected to comply promptly with the provisions of the law by keeping up the discrimination against colored persons who sought to enter its cars. When this illegal action was brought to Mr. Sumner's knowledge, he wrote a sharp note to the president of the company, calling his attention to the failure of his agents to obey the law, and serving notice on him that, unless the breach was mended, he, Mr. Sumner, would at the next session of Congress move the forfeiture of the charter of the corporation. This determined front brought the company to its senses and consummated the final opening of the streetcars of the District of Columbia to all persons regardless of race or color. Slavery is dying on sea and land. Rebellion everywhere through the length and breadth of the South is collapsing under the tremendous trip-hammering of Grant, Sherman, and the Union armies, reinforced now with more than 150,000 colored soldiers. Sherman begins his masterly march to the sea. Now Atlanta falls before the advances of his resistless legions. Now Savannah, now Charleston. Now Grant has begun those incessant and mighty blows which are to drive the rebels from Richmond, to beat to pieces the proud and hitherto invincible army of Northern Virginia, and to force Lee to surrender. All these great events were coming to pass while slavery lay writhing in death throes. Terrible in life, it was appalling in death. Its last act was worthy of it, that act which added the assassination of a president to the black mountain of its matchless horrors and iniquities. Lincoln and Sumner, though unlike, were nevertheless the best of friends. No more faithful supporter had Mr. Lincoln than was Mr. Sumner. They, notwithstanding frequent differences, were cordially appreciative of the virtues of each other. Sumner heartily and unwaveringly urged the president's claims to renomination and reelection. Others of the radical and anti-slavery wing of the Republican Party preferred Chase, but close friends as were Sumner and Chase, the former never disguised his decided preference for Mr. Lincoln as his own successor. Lincoln was slow, excessively cautious perhaps, yet he was in the main inclined abolitionward. At any rate, he was a bird in the hand, while all other candidates were regarded by Sumner as politically so many birds in the bush. He very wisely refused to imperil the anti-slavery accomplishments and prospects of the war in the crisis of a change of administration. The circumstances of his last conference with the President are infinitely creditable to the heads and hearts of both. In June 1864, it appears that the Smith brothers of Boston were, by order of the Navy Department, charged with fraud in the performance of certain contracts with that department. They were imprisoned in Fort Warren, and bail placed at $500,000. The trial of these men was held before a military tribunal, which sentenced them to 2 years' imprisonment and to pay a fine of $20,000. Sumner laid the case of the convicted men before the President and appealed to him to revoke the sentence of the court. Mr. Lincoln, who was evidently impressed with Mr. Sumner's representation of the facts, requested him to read the report to the Secretary of the Navy in relation to the case and to give an opinion of the same. This Sumner did at once and prepared for the President a written opinion thereon. As soon as this was done, he presented himself at the Executive Mansion. It was late in the afternoon, and the illustrious object of his visit was on the point of entering his carriage for a drive. The President suggested that the transaction be put off until next day, but Mr. Sumner replied that it was a case which did not admit of delay, and that the President ought not to sleep that night until he had considered it. Touched by Mr. Sumner's earnestness, Mr. Lincoln made an appointment with him for 11 o'clock that evening. At that hour, and through a thunderstorm, Mr. Sumner joined the President, who was promptly on hand to listen to the opinion which he had requested. At the conclusion of the reading of it, Mr. Lincoln said that he would write his opinion at once, and invited Mr. Sumner to call the next morning to hear it, adding defensively that he opened shop at 9 o'clock. At the time appointed, Mr. Sumner was on hand and read with satisfaction the President's disapproval of the judgment and sentence. While Mr. Sumner was making an abstract of the presidential endorsement, Mr. Lincoln regaled him with passages from the effusions of Petroleum v. Nasby. The reading was diversified with a running commentary from the reader. For the genius to write these things, I would gladly give up my office, he repeated enthusiastically to Mr. Sumner as the message which he had sent the author. This singular entertainment lasted about half an hour. It was the last time that these two great men met for the transaction of public business. From March 23, 1865, the President left Washington to join General Grant at City Point, where he remained until after the fall of Richmond. He returned to Washington April 9th, and on the following Friday evening, April 14th, was shot by John Wilkes Booth and died early the next morning. No more generous and glowing tribute was pronounced over the grave of the illustrious martyr to liberty and union than was Sumner's eulogy before the municipal authorities of the city of Boston, June 1, 1865. True to his habit of ending no speech unless in some way it demanded the destruction of slavery, the orator did not allow such an imposing occasion to pass without calling for the total annihilation of the accursed thing, with its vast spider-like web of caste and inequality. The permanent supremacy in the Republic of the ideas for which the North had fought depended, he solemnly declared, above the grave of the great statesman who had met martyrdom for those ideas, upon the extension of the suffrage to the colored men of the South. Indemnity for the past and security for the future was the one cue which he had chosen to guide his feet through the mazes of reconstruction of the rebellious states. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Charles Sumner, the Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reconstruction and colored suffrage. At the close of the war, the gravest of problems remained to be solved. The riddle of the slave sphinx still awaited its Oedipus. How should local self-government be reconstituted in the old slave states was the momentous question then to be settled. Sumner had his plan, others theirs. His he erected on the simple basis of equality. No mere party considerations entered into its straightforward intention. He was not careful to enfold within his scheme any principle or device looking to the political supremacy of his section as a section. It was freedom which he was ever and solely solicitous of establishing, the supremacy of democratic ideas and institutions of securing and assuring forever to the newborn nation. He desired and strove for the ascendancy of his section and party so far only as they were the actual custodians of national justice and progress, the real possessors of the great and quickening principles of human rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence. Long before the end of the rebellion, Sumner's mind had begun to grapple with this problem. As early as February 11, 1862, he broached the subject in the Senate in a series of resolutions touching the constitutional status of the rebellious states and the duty of Congress in regard to their government and reconstruction. State rebellion is state suicide was the pivotal proposition of the resolution. With the termination of statehood, slavery terminated also, since it derived its existence solely and exclusively from the authority of the state. By reason of their insurrection against the supremacy of the Constitution, the Southern states had reverted to a territorial condition, and like all national territory, their government devolved upon the United States. It was therefore the duty of Congress to assume complete jurisdiction of such vacated territory where such unconstitutional and illegal things have been attempted, and proceed to establish therein republican forms of government under the Constitution, and in the execution of this trust provide carefully for the protection of all the inhabitants thereof, for the security of families, the organization of labor, the encouragement of industry, and the welfare of society, and in every way discharge the duties of a just, merciful, and paternal government. Such was the radical and comprehensive scheme for Southern Reconstruction presented thus early by Sumner. Its introduction produced quite a flurry of feeling in the Senate and the country at large. Republican leaders like Fessenden, Sherman, Doolittle, and others promptly disowned it as the policy of the party. They were not mistaken in so doing, for the Republican party at that time had not so much as dreamed in the brain of any other man than Sumner's of a plan at once so bold and radical for the reconstruction of the rebellious states. 4 years later, however, these very leaders and the great body of the Republican party had caught up with Sumner on this question and occupied then substantially the position taken by him in those famous propositions. These propositions he elaborated and defended in an article published in the Atlantic Monthly for October 1863 and entitled Our Domestic Relations, which the paper contended hinged upon one question, viz., how to treat the rebel states. State suicide and the reversion to territorial conditions of states in insurrection against the supremacy of the Constitution, which was the keynote and the keystone of the article, ran without doubt entirely counter to the constitutional fiction, at once a state, always a state, which lay at the bottom of the policy of the administration in the conduct of the war. So totally distinct was Sumner's idea from that which had officially obtained in the prosecution of the war, that Montgomery Blair, a member of Mr. Lincoln's cabinet, felt it incumbent upon him to take issue with the article and to point out that its author had directly arrayed himself against the President on a question of fundamental policy in the conduct of the war. The tremendous struggle in which the nation was engaged for its life attracted the entire attention, absorbed the utmost energies which could be put forth of government and people. There was neither time nor disposition under these circumstances to consider less imperious questions. Catch your fish and do your frying afterwards. Conquer the rebellious states, then determine how they shall be treated, was the unconscious policy pursued by the government until near the close of the war. Even Sumner, forehanded as he always was where freedom was concerned, was silent on the subject of Reconstruction after the publication of his Atlantic Monthly article until the spring of 1864, when the Senate, having under consideration the credentials of certain claimants as senators from Arkansas, he introduced a resolution declaratory of the necessity of the vote of both houses of Congress for the readmission of rebel states into the Union. And a little later, on June 13th, in fact, when the Senate was discussing a joint resolution for the recognition of the free state government of Arkansas, he spoke with almost unwonted earnestness, urging the importance of making haste slowly in that direction, as well as the duty of securing from the rebel states what he described as irreversible guarantees as a condition precedent to their readmission into the Union, which they had attempted to destroy. The question raised by the joint resolution seemed to him the gravest presented for decision, since it was determined to meet the rebellion by arms, and he opposed the admission of Arkansas at that time and under then existing circumstances as improper, unreasonable, and dangerous. The readmission of a rebel state, he declared, is not less important than its original admission into the Union. It is not enough, he argued, if we comply with certain forms as constitute a state in name only. Much more must be done, and all this must be placed under fixed and irreversible guarantees. Vain is victory on the field if these guarantees are not obtained. But the Senate was not yet ready to grapple with the problem mooted by Mr. Sumner. The resolution for the admission of Arkansas and that of Sumner defining one of the conditions of Reconstruction on reference to the Judiciary Committee were reported upon adversely by that committee, which had the effect for the nonce to push out of the Senate the whole subject of Southern Reconstruction. With the sweeping successes which were attending the Union armies in the field, and the probable certainty of the speedy collapse of the rebellion, the subject of rebel reconstruction began to attract the notice of others in Congress than Mr. Sumner. As early as February 15, 1864, Henry Winter Davis of Maryland reported a bill in the House to guarantee to certain states whose governments have been usurped or overthrown a republican form of government. This bill, among others, provided for the assembling of constitutional conventions chosen by loyal white male citizens. In the Senate, the principle of colored suffrage as an element in the reconstruction of the rebel states was proposed for the first time by an amendment to the Davis bill, extending the basis on which the constitutional conventions were to be chosen so as to include the freed men. But the Senate, by a vote of 5-24, rejected the novel and revolutionary proposition. Clearly, the idea of colored suffrage had not then found a foothold, certainly not more than a foothold in the Republican Party. The House bill was finally passed by the Senate, but even without the new radicalism of suffrage for the Southern Negroes, it failed to meet the approval of the President, and so came to naught another attempt to formulate a scheme for the reconstruction of the South. The principle of colored suffrage the Senate had twice before voted down, first in the case of the Territory of Montana, when a bill organizing for its temporary territorial government was under consideration, and second in the case of the city of Washington, when a bill to amend its charter was on its passage through that body. In both instances, it was attempted without avail to extend the elective franchise to colored men, inhabitants of the territory and the city respectively. Sumner strove strenuously on each occasion against the non-exclusion of colored citizens from the register. About the beginning of 1865, the subject of Reconstruction had made considerable progress upon the attention of statesmen. The case of Louisiana served still further to advance the question in that regard. On February 18th, Mr. Trumbull reported in the Senate a joint resolution recognizing the government of that state, inaugurated by a convention held at New Orleans, April 6, 1864, as the legitimate state government. There was no provision in the new order thus instituted which extended the right to vote to the Negroes. The state, therefore, was to remain in the hands of the very people who voted 4 years before to take it out of the Union. The danger to freedom, to the Northern idea which the war was establishing at an expenditure of so much blood and treasure, seemed to Sumner extreme in view of the possibilities of a return of the South to power, opened by the Louisiana Bill. The readmission of Louisiana was a pet enterprise of President Lincoln. He had set his heart on inaugurating his experimental policy for the reconstruction of the rebellious states with the restoration of this one to its old place in the Union. The joint resolution was accordingly pressed upon the attention of the Senate, and a vote insisted upon, but no vote could its friends obtain, owing largely to the firm and vigilant opposition of Sumner, and to his parliamentary skill in the contest, which continued several days before a postponement of the subject was secured. Another attempt to reconstruct the South thus came to naught. If the Republican party was not then at all disposed to adopt Sumner's plan, it was not altogether willing to swallow the President's for the constitutional rehabilitation of the slave states. The struggle over the Louisiana Bill developed the fact that at that date the Republican Party was not in favor of adopting colored suffrage as a condition of Reconstruction, nor was it included in the President's scheme. On the contrary, it was an open secret that Mr. Lincoln took the failure of the joint resolution to pass the Senate quite to heart. He was sorely disappointed and chagrined, so much so, indeed, that it was thought Mr. Sumner's responsibility for the failure would cause a breach between him and the President. But Mr. Lincoln was a politician of too much calculation and tact to allow the occurrence, however unpleasant, to interrupt the intimate personal and political relations which existed between himself and so powerful a leader. Accordingly, on the evening of March 5th, he promptly stopped the wagging tongue of Madame Rumor by inviting Sumner to accompany him to the inaugural ball, where the two statesmen appeared before the public on the old friendly footing. Had the wise and tactful Lincoln remained at the helm during his second term, it is impossible to say how far he might have been able to control the Reconstruction policy of his party. That he would have exerted a distinct influence in shaping its character seemed not at all improbable, but his death put a man in his place as lacking in his great qualities of mind and heart as it was possible for destiny to pick up wherewith to present a presidential contrast. It is hard to understand why Lincoln was taken and Johnson left, but as there are no accidents in the universe, Andrew Johnson therefore could not have been an accident. We must believe that his accession to the presidency at the time and under the circumstances was one of those historic occurrences through which an increasing purpose runs. About a week after the death of his great predecessor, Chief Justice Chase and Mr. Sumner called in company on the new head of the nation to learn something of his intentions with regard to the reconstruction of the rebel states and to urge him to espouse the cause of equal rights for the colored race. Mr. Sumner fancied that the president seemed impressed. A few days later, Sumner, who was full of uneasiness and apprehension as to the president's course toward the South, called again on Mr. Johnson and had a second conversation with him on matters discussed during the first visit. It is possible that Sumner and the Chief Justice did all the talking at that time, and that Sumner, who was alone at the second call, talked the whole time, then also to the willing exclusion of the president. Be that as it may, Sumner went away believing that he had received from the strange man positive assurances of agreement on the colored suffrage question. To Mr. Sumner's appeal to him to use the power and influence of his great office toward carrying into the new political order then soon to be established in the South the principles of the Declaration of Independence, Mr. Johnson replied, "On this question, Mr. Sumner, there is no difference between us. You and I are alike." Sumner went away deceived in the purpose of the president. It is possible that Mr. Johnson was no less deceived in his own purpose. His visitor and himself forgot, perhaps in the glow of Sumner's earnestness and eloquence, that after all, he, Andrew Johnson, President of the United States, was a Southern man with the traditions, the prejudices, the mental and moral limitations of his section, from the slavery of which no Emancipation Proclamation was able to liberate his mind, free him for one moment as a voluntary and thinking being and ex-slave holder. It was natural enough that such a man should approach the Southern problem from the standpoint of his section rather than from that of the North, and that he should attempt to reorganize civil society in the old slave states in the interest of the old masters rather than of the freedmen. Such an attempt, however, at the time was utterly impracticable, could not possibly succeed. No reconstruction of the seceded states had the slightest chance of adoption as the national policy in that regard, which proceeded upon the absurd assumption that the victorious North had nothing to do with the business. But unfortunately, such was the character of President Johnson's Reconstruction policy. On the other hand, the old slave masters, in the sun of this extraordinary policy, undertook to frame constitutions and establish governments upon a corresponding assumption that their former slaves had no rights which Southern white men were bound to respect. When the work of framing the new constitutions and laws was finished, it was plain to the dullest comprehension that the freedmen were as completely serfs under the new order as they had been slaves under the old one. Nothing was changed except a name. The old wrong lived on, vital in every part. If African serfdom was now to take the place of African slavery, was the serf power to ascend the throne of the slave power also? What then had the war settled? What had the expenditure of the blood and treasure of the North effected if instead of Southern slaves the nation was to be cursed with Southern serfs, if in room of the rule of slave masters there was to succeed the reign of serf masters? Like fire, these passionate questions ran through the North. The conflagration which ensued consumed to the ashes this first attempt to reconstruct the rebel states, but we are anticipating. Congress had adjourned, and Sumner had gone home under the glad impression that the anti-slavery work of his life was ended, when the president began his Reconstruction performance, which, as it progressed from one reactionary step to another, excited through the North astonishment and consternation, accompanied by a rapidly increasing storm of protest and indignation. Northern alarm and Northern demand found voice in a speech made by Sumner before the Republican State Convention of Massachusetts held at Worcester, September 14, 1865. Sumner, in view of the grave emergency which the President's Southern policy had precipitated upon the country, was chosen to preside at this convention. To him, all the friends of freedom turned in the new crisis for instruction and inspiration, and from such a platform his words were sure to go to the ends of the North. Without expressly taking issue with the President, for Sumner and others still clung to the delusion that Andrew Johnson might be made to see the error of his way and be induced to take a fresh departure in unison with Northern sentiment and purpose on the Reconstruction problem, and were therefore somewhat mindful not to launch into hasty opposition to the official head of their party. The Worcester addresses, nevertheless, sounded the keynote of the Republican Reconstruction policy with no uncertainty of meaning. Justice and protection was its watchword. Justice to the freedmen, protection for the North. They were intimately linked, the one with the other. Security for the future should be the cornerstone and keystone of the reconstructed Union. Defeated in war, the South designed now to retrieve its broken fortunes by a resort to fraud and cunning in the restored Union. The abolition of slavery it was scheming to nullify by substituting for it the old wrong under a new name. The freedmen were to be chained to the soil, reduced to serfdom, while the rebel states were to return to their old places in the Union, in consequence stronger in federal numbers than when they seceded to set up a slave empire. This enlarged representation, conspiring with the Copperhead party of the North, would presently reestablish Southern domination in the Republic. This well achieved, the new serf masters would proceed with the execution of their monstrous program, which included a repudiation of the national debt, or else an intention to fasten upon its payment, as a condition, the payment of the rebel debt, also compensation for the emancipated slaves, and the pensioning of rebel soldiers equally with loyal ones. Safeguards, irreversible guarantees, security for the future against these perils must be demanded and insisted upon by the Republican party, speaking and acting for the victorious North. Irreversible guarantees could not be obtained by haste, by executive action, by yielding to the prejudice of color, by oaths or pardons. How then may they be obtained? 1. Time is necessary. 2. Rebels must be excluded from political power. 3. A hand of iron in a velvet glove is required in dealing with the leaders of the rebellion. 4. The North must turn to constant loyalists in the South, regardless of race or color. 5. It must look to Congress, which has plenary powers over the whole subject. And finally, all of the guarantees thus obtained must be completed and crowned by an amendment of the Constitution expressly providing that hereafter there shall be no denial of the elective franchise or any exclusion of any kind on account of race or color, but all persons shall be equal before the law. Thus spoke Sumner to Massachusetts, who in turn took up the stern, deep note and sent it pealing through the North and in the ears of the President. But all heedless of the rising storm, Andrew Johnson bent himself stubbornly upon his obnoxious course. In November, Sumner remonstrated by telegraph with him. They were words thrown away. Republican remonstrance and protest exerted not the slightest effect upon the conduct of the President, who metaphorically had taken the political bit between his official teeth, and regardless of the frantic outcries of the North, was dashing willfully and viciously with the results of the war toward an overturn where all would be lost. The Republican party was almost stupefied with fright. Thaddeus Stevens, who had not yet adopted colored suffrage as a condition of Reconstruction, was almost in despair lest the North should, since the President had proceeded so far, acquiesce in his policy as a finality before the meeting of Congress in December. Stevens had but one hope, which was to get the rebel states in a territorial condition. This was in the line of Sumner's Reconstruction policy. That once accomplished, the Pennsylvania congressmen did not doubt Congress would then be able to deal with the question and avert the impending peril to Northern political ascendancy, which was generally looked upon as one of, if not the capital achievement of the war. Henry Winter Davis saw but two modes of averting the threatened catastrophe of a return to power of the South and the restored Union, and they were for Congress, on assembling, to pass a law by 2/3 over the President's veto, prescribing the conditions of reconstruction of any state government, and declaring none Republican in form which excludes Negroes from voting, or secondly, to pass an amendment of the Constitution over the head of the President prescribing universal suffrage. Mr. Davis did not, however, anticipate with any confidence that the then coming Congress would be equal to these things. He was in despair at the national outlook, and died suddenly when Congress had been in session but a few weeks. Sumner shared in the general dejection and foreboding of disaster. His apprehensions as a statesman and a man were indeed intense. So great were these fears of evil that he determined to make a final attempt to induce the President to hearken to the prayers and remonstrances of his party, and to abandon his mischievous policy in the treatment of the rebel states. On the eve of the assembling of Congress, he called on Mr. Johnson in pursuance of this purpose, and though the interview lasted 3 hours, Mr. Sumner at its close was convinced that the President was beyond the reach of reason, and that there was nothing for the Republican party to do under the circumstances but to annul by congressional action the presidential policy, and to save the results of the war to the North and the Negro by a reconstruction which should guarantee protection to the one and citizenship to the other. The prevision of Winter Davis that the Congress which was to convene in December 1865 would not be equal to the contest with the President was fully borne out by its performance, or rather by its failures in that regard. This was owing partly to the indisposition of many Republican members of both branches to take issue with the administration, lest the doing so should perchance divide and damage the party, but more especially was it due to their strong unwillingness to adopt the idea of colored suffrage as a condition of reconstruction of the rebel states. In one form or another, the equal rights of the colored race was almost constantly before the Congress. It was actually equal, however, to the passage over the veto of the President of the first Civil Rights Bill, which opened all courts, state and national, to colored persons as parties and witnesses as to white citizens, but it could not conquer its prejudice against an extension of the suffrage to the Southern colored man, until assisted by the fall elections of 1866. To cross that Rubicon of Reconstruction, a radical leader like Sumner could not budge it an inch during its long session. The Republican majority of both houses shrank back from colored suffrage, as the government had previously shuffled and played the coward before emancipation and colored troops. How to protect the North and the Republican party against the return to power of the South without resorting to colored suffrage was in truth the problem which the Congress endeavored to solve. Could the ascendancy of the Republican Party be preserved and Northern supremacy in the Reconstruction Union be secured without having recourse to so extraordinary and extreme a measure? If so, that Congress wanted to discover just such a go-between way and to walk therein. This was true then of leaders like Fessenden, Sherman, and Trumbull, who afterwards accepted the new radicalism, aye, of stout-hearted Thad Stevens and sturdy Ben Wade as well. They all in that Congress desired and sought without ceasing another and more convenient way to attain their object, viz., the political ascendancy of their section in the Republic, the erection of a permanent barrier against future tidal waves of Southern domination over it. This grand end Congress attempted to reach by a proposition to apportion representatives among the several states according to population, with a proviso which excluded from the basis of representation all persons excluded from the right to vote on account of race and color. The calculation of the author of the device, who was Mr. Blaine, and of the Republican members of Congress who supported it, was that the South, caught between the upper and nether millstones of it, would rather than have its federal numbers reduced extend the right to vote to the freedmen, in which case the new voters would augment the numerical strength of the Republican Party and so confirm it in power. But if, on the other hand, the South should, in view of these future consequences, refuse to take that horn of the dilemma presented to it by Congress, it would be thrown upon the other horn, which would operate with no less fatality to any future revival of its political ascendancy under the Constitution. Thoroughly clipped in the wings and spurs of it. The dreaded southern bird would, of course, be no match in the national cockpit for the mighty northern fowl. Plainly, the prime object of this scheme was not protection for the freedmen. Protection for the North and the Republican party was the one clear end which it was designed to reach. If the negroes got there too, so be it, but their safe arrival could not be, under the circumstances, chargeable to the Republican party, but to an inscrutable Providence, for whose action in the premises that party could not possibly be held accountable at the polls. Against this compromise proposition Sumner set himself like flint. He was not willing to entrust national security to the chapter of probabilities and accidents to which they were committed by the Blaine Amendment. He would establish irreversible guarantees of freedom and the public faith and the national peace, all of which could be done in but one way, and that was by carrying out in the reconstruction of the South the promises of the Declaration of Independence, by the ample execution of the constitutional injunction to guarantee to the several Southern states, as a condition precedent to their readmission into the Union, a Republican form of government. Nor more nor less would he support or be satisfied with. Colored suffrage, he argued, was not a matter of national choice at all, but an overruling necessity. It was the all-sufficient guarantee, being in itself peacemaker, reconciler, schoolmaster, and protector. And now, he said finally, declaring my belief in liberty and equality as the God-given birthright of all men, let me say, in the same spirit, if this be an error, it is an error I love. If this be a fault, it is a fault I shall be slow to renounce. If this be an illusion, it is an illusion which I pray may wrap the world in its angelic forms. The Blaine Amendment, after a while, passed both houses of Congress, but was vetoed by the President. It was thereupon carried by the lower chamber over the veto, but in the Senate, owing to Sumner's opposition, it failed to receive the requisite two-thirds vote, and therefore was never submitted for ratification to the states. Sumner's opposition to this pretty political contrivance, which was to secure protection to the North and the Republican party at the expense of the Negro, called down upon him from his Republican associates a good deal of harsh criticism. Thaddeus Stevens, in particular, bitterly blamed him for its final failure to pass the Senate over the head of the President. But none of these things moved Sumner from his fixed purpose to make colored suffrage an indispensable element in the reconstruction of the South. The dread of a return of the South to power in the restored Union had another and unmistakable manifestation in this Congress. It was the meaning of the movement to secure the admission of Colorado and Nebraska to the ranks of the states, which would, when effected, give the North 4 more votes in the Senate and as many in the House before the rebel states got back into their old places. Protection was the soul of this attempt, protection for the North, not for the Negro, which the constitutions of these would-be states left no room for doubt. Each of these instruments limited the right to vote to white male citizens. But here again Sumner's uncompromising spirit proved a thorn in the sides of his party. His associates, not all, but many of them, were for creating 2 new states, regardless of the wrong which their fundamental laws did the colored race, because the exigencies of party called for more votes in Congress and the Electoral College. But with Sumner, principle was ever above party. He could not vote to grant the prayer of these applicant states when they came with the stain of inequality and caste upon their hands. No, however great might be the emergent needs of party, he could not and would not vote to admit Colorado and Nebraska until their constitutions were Republican in form and consistent with the Declaration of Independence. Even stanch old Ben Wade did not consider the matter worth fighting for in Colorado, in view of the insignificance of the number of colored people in the territory. But Sumner retorted with characteristic integrity of purpose that we should fight for a principle if by the sacrifice of it only one man was injured in his liberties. In other times, he exclaimed, the cry was, no more slave states. The cry of our times should be, no more states with inequality of rights. After a protracted struggle, Colorado and Nebraska were compelled to abandon the obnoxious distinction contained in their respective constitutions. It was not, however, until the short session that Nebraska got in, and this was achieved over the veto of the President. Colorado was less lucky, and her admission was longer delayed, but the principle of colored suffrage as an indispensable prerequisite for admission into the Union was established by the precedent made in the case of the former. Sumner turned his attention likewise to the abolition of the hateful distinction against color which disfigured the election laws of the District of Columbia. Having become a member of the Committee on the District of Columbia, he pressed the justice of colored suffrage upon his associates until the committee reported a bill prohibiting any exclusion from the right to vote on account of race and color. An educational qualification was at first grafted by way of amendment upon the bill, but it was afterwards rejected in the Senate, owing no doubt to the growing feeling that the suffrage must be without this qualification if the adoption of colored suffrage in the Reconstruction of the South were to act as a barrier against the return of that section to power in the Union. This was at the long session of the 39th Congress, which could not be relied upon for any radical handling of the colored suffrage question in opposition to the President. The bill extending the elective franchise to colored citizens of the district was, under the circumstances, allowed to go over to the short session when the autumn election of 1866 should have occurred, and given the popular cue to dubious-minded congressmen on the subject. The rapidly rising tide of public sentiment was flowing with accumulated force in but one direction, viz., toward a reorganization of the rebel states on the basis of universal suffrage as the only sure guarantee to the continued political ascendancy of the North in the Union. Sumner was therefore wise to postpone action on the district bill to the short session, when the voice of the Northern people should have been heard at the polls on Reconstruction and colored suffrage. On the first day of the short session, he pressed the district elective franchise bill to a vote in the Senate. 10 days afterward, that body passed the measure without the educational qualification provision. The next day, it went promptly through the House. It was vetoed by the President, but was passed by both houses over the veto, and so became a law as well as a guide for similar legislation in the Reconstruction of the South. The 39th Congress, having had its courage stiffened by the elections, was ready to inaugurate a policy of reconstruction of the rebel states in opposition to that of the President. The House took the initiative by the passage of a bill for the efficient government of the insurrectionary states, which, as it went to the Senate, contained no provision in regard to colored suffrage or to the exclusion of rebels. The consideration by the Senate of this bill developed wide divergencies of views on the subject by the Republicans of that body. Some were satisfied with measures of protection simply, while others wanted to add to protection colored suffrage as an act of justice to the freedmen, which would operate at once as a safeguard to themselves against the old slave masters, and the best possible protection to the North from the same class. This latter view finally prevailed with the Senate, which adopted a substitute bill introducing the principle of colored suffrage into the South. This bill was rejected by the House because it did not exclude rebels from the right to vote. Without such a provision, it seemed to Thaddeus Stevens that the measure, instead of protecting, would open the floodgates of misery. The Senate, however, insisting on its substitute, the House receded from its position and passed the Senate bill with an amendment which embodied to a limited extent the principle of exclusion of rebels. This action of the House was concurred in by the Senate, vetoed by the President. The first Congressional Reconstruction Act passed both houses over the negative of the executive, and so became law. Congress, influenced by its fears, had at length got itself in motion and nearly in line with Sumner's position on the Southern question by requiring that in voting for delegates to conventions to frame constitutions for the rebel states there should be no exclusion on account of race or color, and that this principle of equal suffrage should be embodied in the instruments so framed as an indispensable qualification for the readmission of these states into the Union. In addition to colored suffrage as a factor in the Reconstruction of the South, Sumner maintained that it was the duty of the national government to guarantee universal education for that section also, and a homestead for every head of a family of freedmen. He was besides in favor of a more rigid exclusion of the disloyal portion of the Southern population from participation in the government of the Southern states than was provided for by the Reconstruction Act. He wanted a provision incorporated in the Constitution of every Southern state requiring its legislature to establish and support a system of free public schools open to all without distinction of race or color. All these things were included in his scheme for the Reconstruction of the South. All these things he tried again and again to have Congress include in its plan in that regard, but without avail. Two other Reconstruction measures, supplementary to the act passed March 2, 1867, went through the 40th Congress in quick succession. Each of these acts, like the first law, encountered the objections of President Johnson and was thereupon passed over his veto by the two houses of Congress. The contest between the national executive and the national legislature had meantime become very serious. The president seemed bent on balking Congress and defeating the will of the North respecting the Reconstruction of the South. The veto power was in constant requisition by him. With this powerful weapon, he ran a tilt against every measure passed by Congress and bearing any sort of relation to the two races in the South. Not even the joint resolution proposing the adoption of the 14th Amendment by the states was able to escape the presidential negative. On this amendment to the Constitution, the North may be said to have set its heart and hope. The attempt of the President to kill it excited against him in consequence throughout that section passionate indignation and fierce aversion. The people became furiously anti-Johnson. Congress, as the strife waxed between it and the President, became furiously anti-Johnson also. More than any member of either branch of Congress, with the possible exception of Thaddeus Stevens, was Sumner opposed to the President and his Southern policy. And the President so understood it and returned the hate of those great men measure for measure, heaping up and running over. From the steps of the White House, in a speech to a number of citizens who had gathered to pay their respects to him as the head of the nation on Washington's birthday of the year 1866, Mr. Johnson classed Sumner, Stevens, and Wendell Phillips, and with Jefferson Davis, Toombs, and Slidell. And Sumner's animadversions, it must be confessed, were hardly less personal or complimentary to the President, whose message on the Southern situation, the defender of humanity, characterized on the floor of the Senate as whitewashing, finding a parallel between the whitewashing message of Franklin Pierce, which covered up the crimes committed against free Kansas by the slave power, and the whitewashing message of Andrew Johnson, which covered up the actual condition of things in the South. A year later, the Massachusetts senator in the same place did not hesitate to denounce the chief magistrate as a bad man who had exposed himself in a condition of intoxication while taking the oath of office as vice president. His speeches were rated as maudlin, and their author was accused of degrading the country as it had never been before degraded. Nor were there wanting allusions to rumors of pardons sold or of personal corruption, nor yet the ominous invective that the President was the enemy of his country. The denunciation of the President as the enemy of his country naturally enough produced a sensation among the friends of the administration in the Senate. The Speaker was quickly called to order, first by Mr. McDougall, and afterwards on its repetition by Mr. Doolittle. On the first point, the chair, Mr. Anthony of Rhode Island, declared the remarks in order, and on the second point, the question being submitted to the Senate, the language was again sustained. All this was significant, the grave charge against the executive head of the nation, and the action of the presiding officer of the Senate and of that body itself in relation to it, highly significant of the impeachment scheme which Congress was even then preparing for the overthrow of its hated adversary. Sumner's frank, fierce criticism of Andrew Johnson was strongly condemned by several of his Republican associates, like Fessenden and Sherman, on the ground that, as a senator, he would be called to sit as one of the judges before whom the President would be tried in the event of his impeachment. But Sumner held firmly to the complete immunity of the Senate in that regard, and its duty to consider the facts and circumstances of the case in advance of impeachment. For himself, he did not doubt that the President was a bad man, and that he should be watched or removed. This was certainly the view which Congress took of the matter. So decidedly was Congress of the opinion that the President needed to be watched that it hardly dared to adjourn when once it assembled. If it passed an act to check his activity in one direction, he was sure to break out in another. It was move and checkmate, checkmate and move between them according to a sort of perpetual motion. When Congress convened, Sumner begrudged the least fraction of his time for adjournment, which could be added to the term of the session. On one occasion, Mr. Grimes of Iowa moved the adjournment of the two houses at 11:30 on a given date, whereupon Sumner suggested 12 o'clock instead, giving as his reason that he was not willing to leave one half an hour to the President within which he may take advantage of the absence of Congress and issue commissions which might run to the last of the next session. The president had announced his intention to kick out of the government the opponents of his policy, and as he was a man with rather light extremities in this respect, he soon set to work with a vengeance to prove himself as good as his word. The opponents of his policy began to feel, in consequence, an official vis-a tergo as far and as fast as the presidential heels could reach. By the Tenure of Office Act, Congress essayed to restrain to a limited extent this recalcitrant propensity of the president. To Sumner's mind, the check imposed by the act went not far enough. He proposed to include within its intendment all officers and agents except clerks, and the vacation of all offices filled by the president or heads of departments without the advice and consent of the Senate since July 1, 1866, on the last day of the month of February of the year 1867. Sumner's amendment being altogether too drastic a dose of congressional rule for Republican stomachs to take, for there had already developed in the party decided differences and symptoms of reaction in the contest with the executive department of the government. It was rejected by the Senate, but no sooner had the Office Tenure Act become law than the president, through the interpretation fastened upon it by his legal advisers, was able to evade its provisions. And so went on this duel between Congress and the president, growing fiercer and yet more fierce week after week and month after month, until, exasperated to the highest degree of passion and resentment, Congress shot its last error, the impeachment, in the hope of destroying the one-man power of Andrew Johnson. Sumner sat as one of the judges of the impeached president and voted him guilty of the high crimes and misdemeanors charged upon his head by the House of Representatives. Sumner filed a powerful statement of his reasons for so voting. Swiftly, in the track of the congressional reconstruction measures, armed foes sprang up to shoot them to death. Violence and misgovernment arose all over the South. Tremendous scenes and saturnalias of blood and scoundrelism appeared in every state. Thieves and thugs established between them a reign of terror, the like of which history has rarely been called to shudder and weep over. Sectional and party selfishness and short-sightedness was the fatal rock on which the congressional attempt to reconstruct the Southern states was wrecked. The president's policy had left out the Negro and the North. The congressional plan had ignored the South and included the Negro as secondary consideration only. The terrible illiteracy of the new citizens and their appalling poverty this scheme did not grapple with or seek to reduce. Alas, Congress did not perceive that the Southern serf power, so justly dreaded by it, could not be overthrown but by the general diffusion of intelligence and property among those who constitute the basis of that power. No plan or policy looking to the ultimate solution of the Southern problem will prosper which does not seek primarily the education and social well-being of the laboring classes of that section. And this, we think, is what Sumner had in his mind when he proposed a public school system for the South, open to all without distinction of race and color, and a homestead for the head of every family of freed men. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Charles Sumner, The Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimke. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Character and Closing Years. Between the two schools of political thought which have arisen under the American Constitution, viz., the state rights and the nationalist, Sumner held all his life firmly to the principles of the latter. In his published works, the word national is habitually used instead of federal, which carries with it the idea of many independent and local centers of government, rather than that of one supreme whole and authority which belongs to the other. That unity and power was the grand object of attainment of the framers of the Constitution, he had never a doubt. That the Republic had missed the aim of its founders in this regard was owing, he declared, to the fact that slavery with its barbarisms and pretensions had, in its long strife with freedom, taken refuge behind the bulwarks of the states, and thus entrenched, had conducted its systematic and decentralizing operations against the unity and power of the nation. When the combatant fell, Sumner was desirous to demolish in one respect the fortification behind which it had been able to work such mischief to mankind, and to defeat the purpose of the Republic at the same time. And this while leaving untouched many things properly appertaining to local police he believed might be accomplished by placing the great principles and interests of national unity and human rights under central guardianship, to the end that through all the parts there might be uniformity and identity in those regards. Or, as he put it in a lecture in New York in 1867, as in the nation there can be but one sovereignty, so there can be but one citizenship. The unity of sovereignty finds its counterpart and complement in the unity of citizenship, and the two together are the tokens of a united people. Thus are the essential conditions of national life all resolved into three: one sovereignty, one citizenship, one people. It was in pursuance of this sublime idea that he, in February 1869, when the Senate had under consideration a joint resolution from the House proposing the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, offered a bill as a substitute, and vindicated the powers of Congress in the premises on the principle that anything for human rights is constitutional. There can be no state rights against human rights, he exclaimed, and this is the supreme law of the land, anything in the constitutional laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding. 2 years later, speaking in the Senate in support of the Force Bill, he expressed himself again on this head and in this wise: the nation will not enter the state except for the safeguard of rights, national in character, and then only like the sunshine for the equal good of all. Here is a just centralism, here is a generous imperialism. Shunning with patriotic care that injurious centralism and that fatal imperialism which have been the nemesis of France, I hail that other centralism which applies an equal protection to every citizen, and that other imperialism which makes equal rights the supreme law, to be maintained by the national arm in all parts of the land. Any man who follows an object with the earnestness and persistency with which Sumner pursued the one great purpose of his life is apt to be viewed by his contemporaries as a man of one idea. This was true in the case of Sumner, who was looked upon by many in that light, but the criticism had for him no terrors. Whoever does anything with his whole heart, said he with admirable sense at the Republican State Convention of Massachusetts held at Worcester, September 8, 1869, and which nominated him for his fourth term in the Senate. Whoever does anything with his whole heart makes it for the time his one idea. Every discoverer, every inventor, every poet, every artist, every orator, every general, every statesman is absorbed in his work, and he succeeds just in proportion as for the time it becomes his one idea. If Sumner was eminently a man of one idea in this fine way, he was by no means so in that other which implies an incapacity for receiving a plurality of noble ideas. All the best and most advanced thoughts of the age for the betterment of the human family found welcome in the room of his capacious mind, aid and comfort in his all-embracing sympathies. Writing in May 1872 to the convention of the Massachusetts Labor Union, he evinced his interest in the movement for the reduction of the hours of work in words as happy as they are wise. The 8-hour law he apprehended to be especially valuable because it promises more time for education and general improvement. If the experiment is successful in this respect, I shall be less curious on the question of pecuniary profit and loss, for to my mind the education of the human family is above dollars and dividends. He took an early and enlightened interest in the subject of civil service reform, the refunding of the national debt, and the resumption of specie payments by the government, the revision of the tariff and reduction of duties. Financial reconstruction after the war, which he placed in importance and the order of accomplishment, second only to political reconstruction, he clearly perceived required two things at least to make it successful, viz., the maintenance of a national credit and the reduction of the burdens of taxation. And these, he always insisted, should never be forgotten in any measures looking to this grand economic achievement. The Republican party found in Sumner constant and earnest support where principles, ideas were put forward and exalted by it. But when men waxed stronger than they in its counsels and conduct, he was too true to blink at the change for the sake of merely personal and political ends. He promptly raised the voice of remonstrance and rebuke, refused to hold his peace where the offender was no less a personage than the chosen chief of the party and of the nation, as in the case of President Grant. These two great men had unhappily no just appreciation of each other. The man of action and the man of thought are not apt to possess a superfluity of affection or appreciation the one for the other. Sumner, no doubt, honestly believed that Grant knew nothing but war, and Grant as honestly supposed that Sumner had done nothing but talk. But in their quarrel, an impartial observer must needs adjudge Grant very much to blame, much more so than was his illustrious antagonist, who upheld the declining influence of principles and ideas as against the extraordinary personalism and assumptions of the one-man power which signalized the administration of Grant. The civil career of the great general, his best friends must confess, was not a brilliant success. His military training and notions of authority and obedience were not applicable to the office of president. They qualified him admirably to control the operations of war, but not to direct those of peace. He could lead armies better than he was able to lead a political party or manage the affairs of an empire. Sumner shivered his first lance against the president on the occasion of his attempt to annex San Domingo to the United States. Grant had set his heart on the success of this scheme, had used his personal and official solicitation to secure its adoption by Congress, and made frequent visits to the capital for the purpose, had even called on Sumner to enlist his personal influence in its behalf. But Sumner, for reasons sufficient and honorable, was immovably opposed to the scheme, and in two powerful speeches in the Senate thoroughly and sternly exposed the irregular, unworthy, and violent means and methods by which it was being pushed upon the people of San Domingo, while at the same time the independence of Haiti was menaced thereby. Grant would not forgive Sumner for the part played by him toward defeating this pet international venture of the administration, nor would his supporters in the Senate. The military instincts and training of the president treated Sumner's opposition as an act of mutiny to his authority, and for which the great culprit must needs be punished as an example to others of a like disposition. Accordingly, Sumner's friend J. Lothrop Motley, American minister to Great Britain, was recalled, and later Sumner himself was degraded from the chairmanship of the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate. But if Sumner's conduct in the San Domingo business failed to please the administration, it did not fail to please the Republic of Haiti, who, grateful to the defender of her independence, presented him with a gold medal in token of her sense of the value of the generous service rendered to her as a black nation. Believing that the spirit, if not the letter, of the Constitution disabled him from accepting the testimonial, Sumner so apprised the Haitian government, which thereupon presented the medal to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It was deposited among similar treasures in the State Library, where it may still be seen. On May 31, 1872, Sumner delivered in the Senate a philippic which produced a sensation at the time. Its title, Republicanism versus Grantism, indicates its character. The speech was an elaborate and fiercely eloquent exposure of the sins of omission and of commission of the first administration of President Grant. Every one of those sins, and they were many and serious, Sumner, with avenging pen, had written in the pages of his philippic, had written them so large and touched them with such harsh and vivid passion as to make an impression upon the country of the decline of political virtue and of the rise and spread of official incapacity, selfishness, and misconduct, which was not soon forgotten by it. In the presidential canvass which followed, Sumner not only refused to support General Grant for re-election, but threw his influence on the side of Greeley and the liberal Republican revolt. The claims of party and the sacramental unction of a regular nomination were never able with him to override the right of individual judgment, to nullify the rule of conscience and principle. He was essentially a freelance, an independent in politics, the first great mugwump of Massachusetts. Much perplexed as to the course they ought to take in this election, Sumner's counsel was sought by the colored people. He frankly apprised them of his own inability to support Grant and advised them to vote for Horace Greeley. Sumner's watchword for the campaign was the unity of the Republic and equal rights with reconciliation. One of the interesting incidents of the canvass was an open letter from James G. Blaine to Mr. Sumner, arraigning him as recreant to party in principle, and Sumner's response to the same. Finding himself the reply caustically informed Mr. Blaine, with so many others devoted to the cause I've always served, that I had not missed you until you hastened to report absence. Blaine taunted Sumner with the outrage which he had suffered at the hands of Preston S. Brooks. Nast, in a clever caricature in Harper's Weekly, had made the assault do duty for the Republican party and against Mr. Sumner and the liberal Republican movement also. Never while a sufferer, so ran on this particular head Sumner's reply to the open letter of Mr. Blaine, never while a sufferer did anybody hear me speak of him, Brooks, in unkindness, and now, after the lapse of more than half a generation, I will not unite with you in dragging him from the grave where he sleeps to aggravate the passions of a political conflict and arrest the longing for concord. Nothing in hate, he said later in the campaign, nothing in vengeance, nothing in passion. I'm for gentleness, I'm for a velvet glove, but for a while I wish the hand of iron. On the assembling of Congress in December, he introduced a bill to prohibit the placing of the names of battles with fellow citizens on the Army Register or the regimental colors of the United States. This was no new thought with Sumner, for as early as the spring of 1862 he introduced into the Senate a resolution against inscribing the names of victories on the regimental colors of the Union forces. Nevertheless, there forthwith arose an outcry of wrath against him as wanting in patriotism and other partisan absurdities because of the share taken by him in the campaign then just closed. Even Massachusetts joined angrily in the Republican hue and cry against her Bayard, who had ever been in her service, and that of freedom's sans peur et sans reproche. But as in other days, the frowns of friends, the passions of party, the clamor of the populace could not move him from steadfast principles and fixed convictions of right. Nothing for vengeance, everything for justice was his motto as a statesman. It was graven on his heart, bound as a frontlet upon his whole public career. Therefore did he seek reconciliation by the way of liberty and equality. Therefore was he in favor of amnesty and equal rights going together hand in hand, that the disabilities of the former slave and those of the former master should be removed by one act of forgiveness and protection. In his reply to the letter of Mr. Blaine, Mr. Sumner had reminded that gentleman of the fate of the supplementary Civil Rights Bill in a Congress controlled by large Republican majorities in both houses, though urged by him, Sumner, almost daily upon its attention. The passage of this bill, which opened to all without distinction of color, inns, juries, schools, public conveyances, and cemeteries, was with Sumner as the very apple of his eye. He made 2 admirable speeches in support of the measure. In the course of the one delivered in January 1872, he quoted with effect that fine sentence of Rousseau's, that it is precisely because the force of things tends always to destroy equality that the force of legislation should always tend to maintain it. On January 27, 1874, he reintroduced his bill and made a last appeal for its passage. There was a noticeable insistency and urgency about his speech and manner on this occasion. What the Senate would do for equality he would have it do quickly. But with all his earnestness there was also a noticeable calmness, a softening of his austere temper, and even for him an unwonted solemnity and grandeur of tone. Those powerful weapons of his in earlier days, indignation and invective, he had laid aside for those gentle ones, sweet persuasion and appeal. I hope, my friend Senator Edmunds, instead of criticism, said Sumner solemnly, almost sweetly, in the course of his speech, will give that generous support which so well becomes him. He sees full well that until this great question is completely settled, the results of the war are not secured, nor is this delicate and sensitive subject banished from these halls. Sir, my desire, the darling desire, if I may say so of my soul at this moment, is to close forever this question, so that it shall never again intrude into these chambers, so that hereafter in all our legislation there shall be no such word as black or white, but that we shall speak only of citizens and of men. Is that an aspiration worthy of a senator? Is such an aspiration any ground for taunt from the senator from Vermont? Negro citizenship and suffrage Sumner had championed. on high ground, never to save the political power of a party or a section, but as a supreme duty which the Republic owed to each of its children, to the weakest because of their weakness. Equality before the law is, indeed, the only defense which poverty has against property in civilized society. Without it, monopoly becomes crowned king, and labor crouching slave or serf. Well did Sumner understand this truth, understand that wrong has a fatal gift of metamorphosis, ability to change form, color, without losing its identity and character. It had shed in America African slavery. It would reappear as African serfdom, unless put in the way of certain and utter extinction. Equality before the law, he had the sagacity to perceive, could alone avert such a calamity, consummate so vast a good. Strenuously he toiled to make it everywhere a conquering force, the master principle in the political and social life of America. As his years increased, so grew his passion for justice and equality. He never wearied of sowing and re-sowing the statutes of the nation and the mind of the people with the grand ideas of the Declaration of Independence, that American Magna Charta and storehouse of equality. This entire absorption in one lofty purpose lent him a singular aloofness and isolation in the politics of the times. He was not like other political leaders. He laid stress on the ethical side to statesmanship. They emphasized the economical. He, all his life long, was chiefly concerned about the rights of persons, they about the rights of property. Such a soul could not be a partisan. Party with him was an instrument and nothing else. As long as it proved efficient, subservient to justice and truth, he gave it his hearty support. To others, on the contrary, party was as much of an end as it was an instrument. In such circumstances, moral ideas cannot maintain their supremacy in political bodies. The lust of power will push them from the party throne and assume the crown instead. It was therefore a foregone conclusion that Sumner and his party should quarrel. The extraordinary personalism and assumptions of Grant's first administration provided the casus belli. The breach so made steadily widened between Sumner and the leaders of the Republican party. Sumner's imposing figure grew thenceforth more distant and companionless. Marital unhappiness added during these last years to the gloom which was settling upon his life. On October 17, 1866, he was married to Mrs. Alice Hooper, née Mason, of Boston. They did not live long together, and he was divorced from her May 10, 1873. This domestic infelicity ate, harpy-like, into his proud heart. In the summer of 1872 his health gave decided symptoms of decline. The injury which his constitution had suffered from the assault of Brooks presently developed new complications and renewed all the old bodily anguish. A temper always austere and imperious was doubtless not mended by this harassing combination of troubles. Alone in this extremity he trod the wine-press of bitter sorrows. He no longer had a party to lean on. Massachusetts, alas, had joined the harsh, ungrateful world, had turned in anger and with cruel words from her great-hearted son. Her legislature had passed a resolution of censure of him because of his battle flag bill in the Senate, already referred to. That wretched act was, however, tardily rescinded, and a committee sent to Washington in the winter of 1874 to communicate the grateful tidings to Mr. Sumner. No woman's hand administered to him in the crisis of his need. He had nothing but his cause, and to this he clung with the pathos and passion of a grand and solitary spirit. Now the grasshopper became a burden, and the once stalwart limbs could not carry him with the old-time ease and regularity to his seat in the Senate. His chair became frequently vacant. An overpowering weariness and weakness were settling upon the dying statesman. Still his thoughts hovered around their one paramount object. Like as the eyes of a mother about to die are turned and fixed on a darling child, so turned his thoughts to the struggling cause of human brotherhood and equality. Almost his last words were, "Take care of my Civil Rights Bill." For this the great soul would toil yet a little while, but it was otherwise decreed, and the illustrious defender of humanity passed away March 11, 1874, at his home in Washington, leaving to his country and to mankind as a glorious heritage the moral grandeur of his character and achievements. End of chapter 15. End of Charles Sumner, The Scholar in Politics, by Archibald Grimke.